our link to get started. So we are in chapter 6 of a forthcoming book by philosopher Kenneth Smith called Millennia and Microcosm. And chapter 6 is the second of a series of chapters about the medieval period of European history. And the focus of these chapters is to get us to understand how do medieval people see the world, not how do modern people think that medieval people saw the world, when we're trying to make ourselves feel better and we mock them for being the dark age. But for real, what did the world look like to them? What did God and nature and humanity look like, right and wrong and all those things? So we're just wrapping up our second of I don't know, probably 8 or 9 chapters about that.
Oh, you guys, every week or every 2 weeks?
Every week.
Every week this time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So the link that he shared, that takes you to the right chapter. And I'll I'll just drop in the text for the final paragraph, which we're just starting into. Um, the 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 general outline of this book is that it's got 3 main sections. The opening section is about the ancient world, the middle section is about the medieval world, and the final section is about the modern world. And what he wants to do is help us to escape the trap of always looking at the world like a modern by teaching us how do ancients see the world, then teaching us how do medievals see the world, and then using those two perspectives to look back at the modern world and say, what would they have to say about us? Not what do we think that they would say, but what would their criticisms of us be? And so it's to try to shake up our, like the problem of a fish that can't see the water because it lives in the water its whole life. Moderns, we live in the modern worldview, and so we can't see how it actually works. So that's what this book is about: is trying to get us a chance to look at things differently. We're 2.5 years into this. We spent 2 years on the ancient section, and last 6 months have been on the medieval section so far, and we're gonna got another probably year and a half to go on the medieval section before we.
So, can you tell me a little bit more about the author? Like, what is his background? Is he a professor? Is he a journalist?
He's a philosopher, and he taught philosophy for many years um, at universities in Texas and Louisiana before retiring and deciding to be a full-time philosopher. So that's what he does. He lives in a house that looks like a labyrinth full of bookcases. Donald just visited him a couple of weeks ago. So it's like floor to ceiling books everywhere. It's just you've never seen anything like it. It makes libraries look positively demure. And he writes and he studies and he thinks and so a number of us know him personally. Donald and David and I are friends of his, and so we're walking through this book together, sort of chapter by chapter, section by section. He's got a number of other books out there, but most of his books are unpublished so far. He has several that are published, but he's got a whole bunch more that he's already written, and David and I are hoping to put them together for him and get them out into the world, starting with this one.
You
So
better watch out for some of the big theological libraries. If you go past them, they're doing big book throwouts. They'll
yes,
give away books for free or charge $1 or something like that. So some of them look like books that if you bought them today, they'd cost several $100s. You know,
yes,
they'll sort of major texts and stuff like that.
yeah, that's right. He also sells books, and he's got a
So, it's
website.
a dumb question, but when I was reading this, is he saying this from the perspective of the medievals that they thought that Jesus might not be the Son of God? Is that true? I was really surprised by that.
So this is the second of the 2 chapters on the medieval section so far. The first chapter presents the official Orthodox canonical view,
Okay.
what the church believed. This chapter is presenting the view of the many spiritualists who started up
Oh,
little
okay.
monasteries
That's
and
why I really don't know much about religions. I'm fascinated, but that's why I joined this group. I was like,
yeah.
that sounds really surprising that they would say at that time when church was so dominant that Jesus was not necessarily the Son of God. But you're saying many people still believe that he might not be, and it was in the Bible. So,
Yeah, so there's a tug of war between these two parts of the medieval
mm,
world. The
cool.
official part had all the armies and the was fighting wars and doing inquisitions, but then meanwhile all these other people were sprouting up, thinking about, reading the book for themselves, thinking about what did Jesus say and what does it mean, and they often were in conflict
Have
with
you
the
guys
central
ever,
authority.
the only medievalist I've ever really read is Philip Arres. Have you heard of him?
Can you say,
Ares, Philip Ares. He's pretty famous.
can you say that again?
Philip Ares, Ares. I
You
can,
Yes,
mean
I can find,
Arius?
like Arianism.
no, Ares, Ares.
Are you talking about the Greek god of war?
No, Philip Ares, he's a writer. And he studies childhood in the Middle Ages.
Not familiar with his work. No,
I'll find a book and put in the copy at paste.
that'd be great. Thank you.
He's really famous. I mean, he has lots to say about the Middle Ages and how they saw children.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Well, we are just, I think today we're going to finish up chapter 6. We're on the last paragraph. And then I think there's a good chance we might actually get into chapter 7 today. So we'll see what happens. Kenneth writes in a very dense style where he is constantly making references to other philosophers, other writers, other artists. He's constantly trying to, because he was a professor, he's constantly referencing other people's work to get you to look at their stuff. So we sort of slow down on our reading and work our way through and see what his references are. So let's, before I get going though, let's call on Phil who's got his hand up. Go ahead, Phil. What's on your mind?
Yeah, what's on my mind is I guess the contrast between Plato and Neoplatonism, and then finally Augustine. It seems to me I try to bring up in Plato's laws that they conveniently forgot about Aeschylus, about the Oresteia, how in some sense that was close to a kind of democratic society in which the Furies were always getting revenge on people who harm each other, and that with the help of Athena, they finally settle in some kind of thing that's like a court, that in a sense adjudicated relationships and therefore, in a sense, settle into a kind of a more subtle peace. And of course, that was the age of Pericles, who could outtalk anybody. And but I said, what happened was at the age of Plato, it was the age of Sophocles, in which Athens was already fallen behind. And in a sense, they had lost the Peloponnesian War. They were soundly defeated by Sparta in some sense. And so Plato was living in a period in which he has to be cautious and not stick his neck out totally. And I was thinking about the forms. I don't think he had a transcendental form. The forms were unstated, and in some sense, it was somewhat related to mathematics, but it was never consolidated into, let's say, something transcendental, but it was this sort of more vague situation. And what emerged in a sense, because I remember the very first paragraph, actually, the first chapter of Plato's Republic was that Socrates, who was very pious, knew that one thing he knew was that he knew nothing. Uh, Not like Pericles, who thought he knew everything. And so he had to, in a sense, find himself. And he went down to Piraeus to find other opinions so that he could have dialogue with them and learn from them, learn from even the barbarians, because he went and worshiped uh, the, I guess, the gods of the foreign devils, in case it was the case. And what resulted was that what emerged in Plato's idea, of course, Socrates was his mouthpiece, was an openness to ideas. So the development, what I would call cosmopolitanism. In other words, not necessarily believing in others, but learning from them, having dialogue from them. And the cosmopolitanism is the thing that stood in the place of the divine God, which which Augustine, well, first Plotinus and then Augustine, turn it into Holy Scripture in which God projected the understanding, whether mankind is still struggling with understanding. Because with Plato, the idea of the forms was a man-made product, which was, you could say, maybe in air quotes, inferior because it did not come from God. It was finite, and wisdom is always finite. So therefore, in a sense, it was a struggle, and that, but still, there are other human beings who might know something, and you learn from them, and therefore, this cosmopolitanism is, in a sense, creating a union of the one and the many, so that the wisdom of the collective is, in many ways, at least possibly greater than the wisdom of the singular. So I brought in I brought in Heidegger, and Heidegger's problem was that he was too parochial. He did not have enough of a cosmopolitan view because he was trapped in the German locality and everything of that sort. So even though he was a very smart philosopher, he had a weakness that it was not broad enough. And so cosmopolitanism allows you to broaden your finite ideas, even though it's not from God. But that's the best we could do because human wisdom is always finite. And so, are we going to live in a world in which we believe in ourselves? So that's almost atheistic. We believe in ourselves to do the best we can because the world is ever changing and it is not a static system. So that, and I didn't get a lot of agreement about that in the seminar. I just thought I brought it in that in a sense, uh, I think if you want to put it this way, this would be my conclusion. Plato uh, was practically an atheist because he relied on human endeavors rather than a divine God, which we invented. The divine God didn't come down and say something to us. We invented something because we desire this uh, supernatural transcendence that, in a sense, human beings are always at a loss. But that's what we are. We're always at a loss. Okay, that's what I want to say, that in some sense the transition was a much harsher transition from the Greeks to the Christians, and particularly uh, uh, when Rome itself started as a republic and later, around the period of Augustus, it became an empire. And that empire, in a sense, was an empire of power. And that's when Christianity, the formal religion, become, in a sense, an ally of the power, and that's what developed into a religion that has much more of a control over the religion and the power rather than even at the beginning when it was much more open to other possibilities. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. I take that as your response to Donald about summarizing, uh, and it certainly covers the ground. It's interesting to look at this transition, and this is for Michelle's benefit. This is part of what we've been doing in chapters 5 and 6, is not only introducing these ideas from the medieval period and how radically different they are from the ancient ideas, but also talking through the transition, why and how it happened. Why would people, give up the ancient worldview and embrace the medieval worldview? How did that come to pass? And how did the way it come to pass modify the teachings of Jesus to turn them into something that could be an imperial religion, religion of conquest, which is what the medieval period. Which is what the Orthodox part of the medieval period was about. They wanted to eliminate all the religions. It was basically an optimistic, enthusiastic program of religious genocide, and with the belief that if we exterminate all the religions, then we'll finally have peace on earth because people will be getting their marching orders from God, who is all good, all knowing, all powerful, and everywhere. The only way to cure the ills of the Roman Empire. That's the promise that sort of launches the medieval revolution, is that they've got the answer. And of course, it's didn't work out the way that they planned, but we'll get to that. Right now, we're just talking
Rick, but there's only the Orthodox and everybody else is heretics.
Yes, well, I mean, what we're seeing in chapter 6 is a bunch of those heretics, right? And in the chapters to come, I'm going to start. My wife Beverly made me a list of medieval mystics, and so we'll be augmenting Kenneth's text with a little tour of various holy men and women and mystics and what they thought that might not have entirely agreed with the Orthodox position. And this is the struggle that the medieval powers have, is that on the one hand, they want to exterminate all variation from what they consider to be their pure perfect position. But on the other, they need all of these other groups. They can't afford to, fully let the Christian world just break into a bunch of schisms. They're trying to make one big powerful group. So they're constantly having to compromise and say, oh, okay, Francis, you can have your own Franciscan monks. Oh God, okay, Benedict, you can have your Benedictine monks. They're constantly, there's these satellites positions around the Orthodox positions. And
well, that's in the name. Catholic, universal, the universal church.
Yes.
The one big tree for every monkey to sit on.
Yes. The one big one. Yes.
Hey, Steve, you caught me. I'm a heretic.
Yeah, well, there's so many of them.
That's right. Don't worry, Phil. Your time will come. Michelle, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so just going back to Heidegger, I felt like I kind of took issue with Phil's definite compartmentalization of Heidegger. I thought he was talking about Hegel at first, so I heard H something and I couldn't hear the rest. And thank you for clarifying that he was talking about Heidegger in Germany. I mean, Heidegger in Germany, he was writing, a lot of his writing was after Oswald Spengler wrote Decline of the West. Who here has read Decline in the West, or at least read parts of it? Okay, so his thesis is that in the Decline of the West, rise to East, right? Rise to China, rise to Japan, rise to East. That's a thesis in one sentence. And there's a necessity cosmopolitanism. When one side is declining, then one is more intrinsically tied to cosmopolitanism, because one realizes that one's way of life is going extinct and one has to compromise with the rest of the world, the so-called barbarian, so-called unknown. So, there's a reflection of that. And Oswald Spengler, I think he published Decline of the West, the first part 1 in 1918. So that was a lot. So, I'm sure Heidegger read Decline of the West. It was such a big book. So I'm sure Heidegger was familiar with that. And he knew the way of Germany, the way of the West being dominant was in many ways ending. And Spengler, he was absolutely right in the rise of the East. His predictions were absolutely right. And it's not like the East is necessarily dominated the West, but we reached a point where people are talking about China dominating the West.
Yeah, there was an interesting PBS series that came out in, I think, the 1990s called The Pacific Century, that says, Europe and the United States and Australia kind of imagine that the 20th century is about them. But if you actually watch the course of the last 500 years, the biggest change in the 20th century is the rise of Asia as a world power. And, basically matching the West on every level, in terms of, industrialization, military power, education, literacy, all these things just, tremendously change over the course of the 20th century. And what happens in Europe and America and Australia, although very interesting to us who live there, is not actually as big a change as what happened in Asia. So you could see, it's interesting what you're talking about with Spengler's book, that
something else is
sees it
interesting
coming,
too.
right?
Yeah, something else is interesting. I was reading a book called On Shanghai, and it kind of said and all those development of Shanghai, and the author made some kind of assertion when the business corporations came to, you know, make money from the people in Shanghai and China and everything, and have a global transaction,
Yeah.
religion came too. And the Catholic Church has traditionally paid attention to India, but ignored China. And now, like, they're thinking about entering into China and becoming full force, a dominant Christian force in China. Like, it's a church that's really going to make that difference. And actually, the Bible is selling really, really well in China. I think it's #1 bestseller. So, and overall, it's #1 bestseller. And people are fascinated by Christianity in China. So, I mean, it seems like, I mean, the question is, like, back then they sold the Silk Road, right? Or did they discontinue the Silk Road during the Middle Ages? I really don't know much about the Middle Ages, but what was the relationship between the Silk Road and the Middle Ages? Um, and then were there like priests even back then who were going to China? You know, I mean, with the Jesuits, they were like, they started around 1600s, I think. So that was after kind of Middle Ages. That was like early modernism, but like, I mean, they were like interested in foreign countries because they wanted a bigger, I mean, part of Christianity is proselytization. So they have to, you know, kind of bow down a little bit to local customs in order to proselytize. That's always been part of Christianity. I mean, with Christmas and everything, the Germans, I mean, say Jesus was born in like June or July, and then Christmas is in December because that just, you know, converge with the pagan holiday in Germany, and they bow down to local customs in order to proselytize.
Yes. Yeah, there's evidence of Christian missionaries in China within the first 500 years of Christianity. I mean, you
Oh,
don't have to wait
wow.
don't have to wait till the Renaissance. There's stories in China. There's books, there's old buildings that have crosses on them that date way back, I mean, to that era. So it's like Islam, in its first few centuries, Christianity really spread fast all over the place. So, but we'll have time to get to that. This is why we're taking our time with this section on the medievalists. We want to have time to explore these ideas.
I think it was by about 700 AD, there was actually a large population of Christians in parts of China.
Yes,
But the emperor came down on them, didn't like them.
but the Mongol emperor liked them. That was later, but you know, they did well in Mongolia up to a point. Anyway, why don't we dive into the text for today? I've got it handy, and we'll wrap up chapter 6 here. So what we've been talking about is in paragraphs 4 and 5, we've been looking at this discussion of how, even though we saw in chapter 5 the extent to which the medieval worldview really upends the ancient worldview, everything the ancients thought was the most important got dumped to the bottom of the priorities, and things that the ancients thought were vices, the medieval said no, those are virtues. And so there was a revolution in values, what, as Nietzsche calls it, a transvaluation of values that happened over this boundary. But what we're seeing in paragraphs 4 and 5, we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, this idea that, weirdly, even though that's the case, when you actually read some of the things Jesus says in Mark and you compare them to what the ancient Greeks say, there's an enormous amount of overlap about the issue of taking personal responsibility. What in the modern world we call owning your own bullshit. Whatever problems you're bringing to the picture to make things worse, you know, Mark's Jesus thinks that you have a responsibility to deal with those things, to not hide from them, to not look for just an escape, but to be a grown up about the ways in which you make your life worse and other people's lives worse, and you have to intervene and deal with that. And that's exactly the value system that Aristotle talks about and Thales talks about and other Greek philosophers and writers. That they're saying this idea that what happens in our lives is partly due to contingency, and that's outside our control, but it's partly due to agency, the things that we want, the actions we take in the world, and the unintended consequences of those. And the Greeks say that arises from our character, and that human beings have a responsibility to cultivate their character, to try to make it better, try to identify the weak spots in our own character, and figure out, what do I have to change in my life to develop better habits, to build a better character, so that I'm less likely to do that bad thing next time. And that aligns very closely with Mark, you know, what Mark's got Jesus talking about. So this is interesting, because this, in chapter 5, we were looking at the orthodox position, the canonical position, which de-emphasizes Mark and emphasizes John and Luke. right? So it sort of moves into the more spiritual. The focus is to get to heaven, and Jesus is a get out of hell free card if you just have faith in him. Whereas Mark really is downplaying that side and really focusing on, you people need to grow up. Mark has the grumpy Jesus. Cranky Jesus in Mark is constantly yelling at his disciples, and by the end of Mark, he's sick of them. When the tomb is empty at the end of Mark, neither Jesus nor anybody he meets tells the disciples. The disciples are left in the dark. Mark's had it with them, and so he's really portraying a different kind of relationship that between man and God, and between a person and their own character, and thus this is sort of hints at what Donald was asking the initial question about spirit, right? Because what happens when you put your soul, your character, into motion? Kenneth Smith often says spirit is soul in motion. It's through transformation and growth and action in the world. So that's the setup as we go into paragraph 6, the final paragraph to wrap up this chapter. We're coming right out of that discussion about the curious similarities, and we talked about how it wasn't entirely unexpected, considering that, contrary to what people say today, where we sort of imagine Judea as being an entirely Hebrew speaking or possibly Aramaic speaking place, but the actual history shows that over half of Jews couldn't speak Hebrew back then. It was a very Hellenized area, and lots of people spoke Greek or Latin in Judea, and so people had been not only had they been raised within the synagogue and the temple and the teachings, but they had also been marinating in Greek ideas and Roman ideas long before the Roman conquest of Judea. So maybe we're not surprised to see some overlap in this stuff. So I'm going to read the opening sentences, and then we'll talk about them, and I'll call on Michelle in just a second. So Kenneth starts out, man's will is a principle over the moral order. Of course, by principle, he doesn't mean the modern principle. He means an arche. He uses the Greek terminology, arche. So he's talking about a fountain of order, a source of order in the world, where teleology comes from. Our will, reflects our character, and when he puts it over the moral order, he's talking about the fact that we've got this tug of war between, what would be good for us, what would be healthy for us on the one hand, versus what is it we want? What are we trying to do on the other hand? We talked last time about hamartia, missing the mark, and how the Greeks believed Homo sapiens is unique among all animals and plants for being the one species that has no compass in the brain that points us frequently towards what's healthy. We have no idea what's healthy for us. We're full of enthusiasms, and we pursue our enthusiasms with great vigor, but the enthusiasms often have nothing to do with what's healthy for us. And they might even be terrible for us. They might, we get into world wars, we get into genocide, we get into ecocide, and we do those things with great, conviction and vigor, even though you would never catch a cheetah going, I know, I think I'll exterminate all the lions. It doesn't occur to them. They don't have that flexibility, that freedom. So moral order, he's talking about man's will as a principle over the moral order. He's talking about this tug of war between what would be the right thing to do versus what is it we want to do. Our will drives us to say, well, I think I'm going to watch old episodes of Star Trek today. That's what I'm totally on fire for watching old Star Trek episodes. Maybe I need to pay my bills, but I don't care. That bores me. Maybe I should go take a walk, but I don't want to. I want to see Spock and Kirk and McCoy having an argument on the bridge of the Enterprise. Where does that come from? People are willful animals. So let me pause for questions. Michelle, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
A little bit about that. I was thinking about this. I thought it was kind of interesting proposition. I have a friend, not really a friend, a minor friend, just someone, I went to his wedding, and he made a video about Protestantism versus Catholicism. Now, I always thought that Protestantism traditionally had a greater focus on Acts, and I thought Catholicism had a focus on more like spirituality. belief and just kind of a transfiguration of the soul. And he actually, his point of view was completely different. I mean, he came from a Lutheran perspective, and he was like, we were just focused on loving Jesus. So like that was the main point about religion, and that's most of evangelicalism, I would argue. Obviously, I never knew that about Lutheranism, but that's true about Lutheranism, true about a lot of other Protestant faiths as well. Evangelicalism about loving Jesus, loving Jesus, loving Jesus, and then in continuity with that is loving Jesus. Jesus has endless grace, and I don't think there's any full support for that in the Bible, that Jesus has endless grace. But I mean, I was talking to a Methodist minister, and she was like, grace, grace, grace is unlimited. Grace, she just spouted on for half an hour about grace, grace, grace being unlimited. And I'm like, she's a fucking minister. I thought she would have read the Bible, and she would have read Mark, of course. I don't think grace based on the Bible is 100% unlimited based on the Bible. And yet the Protestants are supposed to be the ones that are reading the Bible. So, I mean, it seems like Catholicism already achieved so much theologically, morally. They achieved so much marriages, and it seems like we're almost like treading back. We're almost going more barbaric and more insane, really, in our rhetoric about Christianity than the high art of the medieval ages.
Thank you for pointing that out. Sorry. Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of diversity among the different Christian sects. And it's not even just a split between Catholic and Protestant and the different Protestant groups. The Catholics are split because you've got the Roman Catholics, but then you've got the old Catholics who split because they didn't believe in the infallibility of the Pope. When that was declared, they split off and said, nope, nope, we're not down for that. And then long before that, you've got the splits of the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox. You've got the Coptic Church in Egypt, Ethiopia and Egypt. You've got the Syrian Church, and of course, as Stephen was saying earlier, you had a lot of Christians. You had the Nestorian Christians. So all of these different groups kind of took different ideas and different balances. But certainly the part that you're putting your finger on, faith versus good works, that was what Luther was having his big fight about when he nailed the theses to the church. Is he, at the late medieval period, good works had been corrupted into buying indulgences. The rich people could behave badly, but then just give the church some money to be forgiven for rape and slaughter and warfare. And people had it because it was like, this, how is this good works? And this is where Luther goes to the extreme and says, fine, screw good works. The only thing that matters is faith. You've got to absolutely focus on faith. And if you are faithful, the assertion was, then you will naturally want to do good works. That was Luther's argument. The good works will follow, and they'll be real good works, not fake buying indulgences good works. Of course, the next 500 years hasn't entirely borne that out. We've seen plenty of Protestants in charge of the slave trade and world wars and so forth. But that was the premise, and it was, of course, a massive reaction against the corruption of the late medieval period. One of the things we've talked about, and we're going to focus on it in the last 6 months of this 2-year period on the medieval section. We're not focusing on it so much now, but just for the sketch, there is a deep irony about the medieval period, which is that it starts out as a revolt against corruption. The late Roman Empire is so rotten and so corrupt. They're like, this is intolerable. We can't do this anymore. So it started as, what can we do to
I missed that. Did you say Roman or did you say medieval?
The medieval movement began as a revolution to overthrow the value system of the late Roman Empire, because they said the Romans were so rotten and corrupt. We need something new, and we're gonna instead of a world run by nature, we're gonna try a world run by God. And maybe God can be pure and perfect in a way that human nature can. And so the great irony,
it's the nature of things that kind of speaks to the Roman point of view.
Yeah, the Roman and Greek point of view was that it's nature is in charge of everything, and that the gods are just expressions of nature, and man is at the bottom of the totem pole underneath the gods who are underneath nature. But the medieval revolution overthrows nature and turns it into just a creation of the one transcendent God, who's not bound by nature and can do whatever he wants. And their hope was that this pure, perfect source would then trickle down into politics and create good politics and peace on earth. But the irony is that over the next 1,000 years, they went from being the people who fought against corruption and lobbied tremendously against, we have to end the old order because it's rotten, to having, by the 1400s and 1500s, just the most spectacular forms of corruption the world had ever seen. Popes having kids and getting, playing politics, and I mean, just all kinds of stuff was rotten by the 1400s and 1500s. So that causes the Protestant Reformation as a counter reaction. And so there is this horrible thing that we're going to have to explore over this 2-year period, which is, how did things go from being so hopeful and idealistic and revolutionary and anti-corrupt? How did it devolve eventually into the corruption and the hypocrisy and so on at the late period? So we'll get to that, but that's sort of a sketch ahead of time. So Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, on that question, yeah, this idea, kill all the lions. If the cheetah got the idea of, let's exterminate all the lions, and this points to the abstract thought. This is a thing that we have this engine going on in our head, is the ability to abstract things, the ability to pull all the drawers out of the furniture. And it's a bit like the magician's apprentice, isn't it? That it can be very easily a power that's very easily used badly. And you get those people that say that their understanding of nature is due to sensitivity and that thought gets in the way. So we've got this power of thought, which you might say gets in the way of the healthier instincts. So the ability to abstract is, oh, well, you have a horse and there's a horn on the narwhal, so we'll pull the horn off the narwhal and stick it on the horse and call the horse a unicorn. Now, in reality, this might cause certain problems, but the intellectuals aren't worried about this. And I'm beginning to deplore the type of intellectualism that goes on today, that you get intellectuals who think that their intellectualism is the ladder that will take them to the pinnacle of all knowledge. And I suspect it might actually be a dead end. Goethe seems to suggest that there is something beyond the intellect. And the intellectuals are actually working with a lower quality, and this higher quality has been lost to their sight. So it's a question of this ability, the ability to abstract, can be destructive, very easily, very destructive. It's like pulling the clock apart, but how do you get it back together? I was thinking of the comedy, actually. The other bit was that comedy, Blackadder. At the end of the first one, which, the first one was in the medieval world, and there was Prince Harry, who was the brother of Blackadder, and he was utterly medieval in his outlook. When Blackadder was dying, Blackadder looks up to Harry and he says, "What are my chances?" And Prince Harry goes, "Good, good." And Blackadder goes, "You mean I'll live?" "Oh." And Prince Harry goes, sorry, I thought you meant I'm going to heaven." So this medieval quality, "Oh, you're dying. Don't worry about that. That's irrelevant. The important point is to get to heaven." Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, this existentialist tradition that Kenneth Smith works in, it comes out of the Greeks, it comes out of Hegel, it goes through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Kafka and others, and it espouses the idea that there's more than two things going on in the brain. There's more than the subjective and the objective, and it's in the modern world that there's a flatland that forces away the third faculty and makes no niche for it. But this idea that on the one hand, we have the subjective, concrete, experiential, parochial faculty of Begriff, which is strongly connected to reality, but only reality right where we are. And then there is this abstract intellectualizing, universalizing faculty of Verstand. And 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 then what Goethe is saying, and Hegel and Kenneth Smith and Hannah Arendt would agree, is that there is a third faculty. And the third faculty is, if you don't let yourself be trapped into Begriff, and you don't let yourself be trapped into Verstand, but you tether them together into a dynamic system like a bow, so they critique each other, then you are capable of Vernunft, which is Hegel's third faculty. And that's where it has all the universalizing, intellectualizing power, but it's tethered to concrete experience to keep it from going off into la la land, to keep you from thinking, I know I should kill all the lions. Let's do that. It's like, no, experience does not bear that out. Let us not kill all the lions. It's what happens if intellectualism is grounded in concrete reality. And the Greek argument is that third faculty, Vernunft, if this is for Michelle's benefit, the others have heard me give the summary before, is that Vernunft represents the mature adult form of the human mind, that people are supposed to grow through from Begriff, which is pretty much where we are as infants, through Verstand, and then into Vernunft. The Greeks talked about this as gnosis, noesis, and phronesis is the term used for Vernunft. And Stephen's absolutely right that from the perspective of Vernunft or phronesis, the kind of what passes for intellectualism in the modern world is such an empty, shallow thing. It's so ungrounded. You never know what it's going to attach itself to, but you can be pretty sure that sooner or later it's going to be a nuclear bomb or a Holocaust or some terrible idea for purifying society. We'll just get rid of all the Jews and make a pure, perfect world. It's like, no, you're abstractivizing again. Stop it. And Hegel actually says to abstract is to be in error. That's how deeply he criticizes pure intellectualism. He says it's way too ungrounded. It divorces itself from reality, sort of as the normal operation of the intellect. And you really have to, that's why you need science. You really have to tether the intellect to reality to keep it from coming up with grand design. Maybe you put universal abstraction, hand in hand with desire and will. And the next thing you know, you've got Hitler saying, well, I wish I lived in the Wild West of Karl May's novels. I know, I'll just pretend that Europe is the Wild West and the Slavs are the Indians. And instead of going west, we'll go east and we'll make a United States of Germany and it'll be a Third Reich. And won't that be wonderful? What a beautiful world I'll live in. And the whole thing is a fantasy. It's an intellectual fantasy that he's going through. And, based on...
Spengler thought he was making a horrible mistake.
Yes. Well, indeed. Most of us would agree. Yes.
I tend to notice that. That's fascinating. When you get into sort of what became Marxism, there was this attitude of let's wipe the slate clean and rebuild.
Right.
What is there? This is year zero. We see that in China with Mao,
Mm-hmm.
There's all the bourgeois, the people who are actually producing everything and running everything. They're the bad guys. We can get rid of them and replace them with peasants.
You see
The
that with
peasants
Pol
are the
Pot, right?
good, honest, pure manure of the earth.
Yes. And Pol Pot, the problem is the intellectual, so let's just kill everybody who's educated. Just once we get rid of them, surely paradise will follow. And these are logical syllogisms. And they only seem crazy for us because we're not willing to talk. They seem irrational to us because we've attached ourselves to rationality as though it is the solution and not the problem. And if we would let ourselves fully immerse ourselves in Maoism or Pol Pot's position, once you see the premises, the horrific conclusion follows logically. And it demonstrates the dangers of logic. When you use pure abstract reasoning, you can arrive at the most hideous conclusions. It all depends on where your premises were. But you could be perfectly logical every step of the way in your derivation. Logic does not protect you from being a Hitler or a Pol Pot. It can happen just like that. It's when you tether yourself to reality, like, say, what if these people aren't abstract numbers on a spreadsheet? What if they're actual human beings? And I shouldn't do math with them. I shouldn't say, and I'll just subtract out all the Romanian Jews, and then I'll have my perfect pure society. Yeah, this is anyway. I'm just really
Is there a
reinforcing what you
doctor in
said.
the house? Oh,
Is
sorry, you shot him last week.
Yeah, that's right. You offed him last week. So I'm merely just reinforcing what you said, Steve. This is three. This existentialist says there's not two modes. It's not left brain, right brain, objective, subject. There's three. And the three is what happens if you use both parts of your brain rather than trying to commit to one half-witted solution and demonizing the other faculty of the brain as though evolution didn't know what it was doing and made a mistake by giving it to you. It's like we need them both. They're both there for a reason. They both supply really important faculties to the human being. But if you use them both together, it's totally different than if you use just one of them. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
What's on my mind is you mentioned the flatlands. The flatlands started way earlier than that. I'm talking about the period of Christ. And one of the things that I think the Council of Trent, but I might have that wrong, but some council have censored a lot of gospels that was no longer the orthodoxy. I'm particularly interested in the Gospel of Judas. Now, we all see Judas as the betrayer of Christ, but Judas reminded Christ that he was a man God and he was weak. The important thing for him to do was to die on the cross so he could become fully God, because Jesus was saying, Father, why have thou forsaken me? Because he still was a man. And he needed, in a sense, somebody to betray him, because the most important thing is that he gets betrayed so that he get nailed to the cross and become truly a divine being rather than a man God that's still trapped in the body of a man. And why, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Judas says the most important thing is that you have to be betrayed because your important thing is sent to heaven, not be grounded still as a man God. So Judas was censored for what he did. He did the heroic thing by sacrificing himself as the eternal villain when he was doing the only thing that was important, which was to make Jesus transcend the physical world in order to become truly a divine being. So that's interesting that somebody would be heroic enough to forsake himself so that he would be a villain forever, despite the fact that he actually saved Christianity. So that was interesting that the Council of Trent censored the Gospel of Judas. That was a flatland, if there ever was one, at least in relationship to Christianity. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there are endless arguments among the early Christian theologians about every detail of the Passion, and the role of Judas is a big one. Is Judas a hero or a villain? And half of what determined whether or not books like that were going to be included was, is the sect of Christianity that has adopted that book one that we like or don't like? Do we think we can marginalize them, or do we think we have to include them? So this is how Revelations ends up in the Bible, but Judas doesn't. Is too many people were attached to Revelations. If they discussed, we have the documentation. They discussed leaving Revelations out of the canon. They really wanted to. They said there's some batshit crazy stuff in there, but unfortunately, there's too many people attached to it. If we get rid of it, we're going to lose them, and then we'll split the church. So we'll keep it in there. But we think we can get rid of this other thing, like the Gospel of James. They figured we think we can ditch that one. So yeah. All right. Well, Michelle's out of the room at the moment. We'll come back to her. For the moment, let's go back to the text. So we started out paragraph 6. Man's will is a principle over the moral order. He lives under a regime which is his own activity echoed or mirrored back to him. A relation which the Greeks comprehended as the paradoxical middle voice, the circular or self-reflexive action upon oneself, which is at one and the same time active as well as passive. So for those who don't know, ancient Greek is very complicated language, but in addition to having an active voice and a passive voice, they have a middle voice. And the middle voice is a reflexive voice in which you are both actor and acted upon. And that's what he's talking about here. And it's handy for all. It turns out if your language has a middle voice, you can use it for all kinds of things. And then having done that, you now make it difficult for everybody who wants to translate that text into a language that doesn't have a middle voice, like English does not. But this issue of this goes back to Joe's thing about agency and contingency. It's easy to take the position either that the outcome of our life is 100% determined by our intentions and will. We see plenty of people arguing that to this day, or to argue that nothing is our fault and everything just happens to us. And you see plenty of people arguing that to this day. But the sort of the existentialist take on this is that the truth is, like Joe likes to say on these calls, the truth is a dialectic between agency and contingency. It's some of each. It's some of each. We are in fact contributing to our circumstances. We don't determine them, just like the fates, don't determine it. It's a tug of war between what just happens to be happening around us and what it is that we're setting out to do and what we care about and what we notice. So this is what he means when he says man lives under a regime which is his own activity echoed or mirrored back to him. He's talking about agency and how many unintended consequences in our life end up determining what happens to us next. This is, if you read books like Robert McKee's Story, where he's explaining how to do storytelling and script writing, he says that one of the things that distinguishes a plot from a story is in a plot, a whole bunch of things just happen and then the book's over. And so what? But in a story, you have the willful, that the protagonist is a willful character who's ripe for change. And he is trying to act in the world. And his actions create unintended consequences. That is, he thought that he was taking a reasonable action to solve his problem. But when he took that action, it didn't solve his problem. Instead, it created another problem. And how he feels about that determines whether you're in a romance or a comedy or a horror story or an action adventure or what have you. But I mean, that there is a spine of a story that's made up of what Robert McKee calls these gaps, emotionally charged gaps between what the protagonist thought would happen, what we might have thought would happen if we agreed with the protagonist, and what actually happened. And now what are you going to do? You can watch Raiders of the Lost Ark by Steven Spielberg entirely in this mode. Things do not work. It's a perfect example. Things do not work out the way Indiana Jones wants them to. And even when he's taking even when he's not being foolish, even when he takes actions, you're like, yeah, totally do it, Indy. That's gonna. And then it's like, oh, damn it, no, that didn't work out. The guy took his whip away, or the other guy ran off with the idol, or it's like things are going crazy, or he thought he could make the jump, but he can't, and now he's falling down the pit. There's this constant flow of gaps in rapid succession, each one given enough time for you to feel the impact of it. And it's why by halfway through the movie, he's all beat up and bruised. Things have not gone the way he expected. And this is what Kenneth is talking about. This idea for storytelling comes out of this Greek notion that it's important to illustrate on the theater. Important, it's sacred, right? Under Dionysus, the sponsor of the theater, it's important to illustrate how it is that our own character pushes us to try things that are in keeping with our character, that somebody like us would want to do that or would try to do that. And as a result of that character, our life doesn't go the way we think it will, because what seems reasonable to us might have nothing to do with what's reasonable in the real world. And it might have nothing to do with what a different person in that same circumstance would have done. It's why people who watch the old Star Trek episodes sooner or later can start to predict, what would Spock say? What would Dr. McCoy say? What would Scotty say? They start to come together as characters. We start to be able to see how the things that happen to them are partly driven by their agency and the shape of their character, not just by the contingency. So this is a weird situation for Homo sapiens to be in. The cheetah on the Serengeti does have a dialectic between agency and contingency, but there's a lot of contingency. And their agency is half programmed into them through their instincts, through evolution, through the things that they care about or don't care about. But with Homo sapiens, we got this crazy deal where we got stripped of a whole bunch of that sophrosune. The compass in the brain is gone. But we got left with creativity and intelligence. So God knows what's going to seem like a good idea to us from one day to the next. But whatever it is, we're going to act on it. And the consequences of that are going to shape the world around us. It's going to come back to bite us tomorrow based on the things that we did today. So morally, a great deal of what we're wrestling with are the unintended consequences of our own choices and actions and desires. That's what he's talking about here. The way that the world that we confront looks like a reflection in some way of our own character. And this is especially true, the point he's making here is especially true if you think about culture as a human creation. Effectively, we, through participating in our culture, we create our culture. And then our culture shapes us and shapes the next generation. And it determines what's legal and what's illegal and all that. So our world has an enormous, this is something Phil talks about a lot, about there's a second nature here. There's the first nature, which is the world as it is before we mess with it. But there's a second nature, which is that we are generating this labyrinth of consequences all around us, not only through our own actions, but through the culture that we're living according to and generating around us. And so the Narcissus myth comes into play here. The Daedalus trapped in the labyrinth of his own making comes into play here. All kinds of stuff is relevant. Michelle, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I was just looking up the first pope was Pope Gregory, right? First pope in the Catholic Church, Pope Gregory, and he made a big deal about incest, right? The way he defines it is not just sibling incest, not just mother, father, whatever. He also defined it as cousin incest. So, I mean, we all know he was very against incest. Church policy was very defined by that. And the reason the church was so careful about genealogy is they want to make sure to avoid incest. But then with the whole concept of divine right and divine right of kings, I mean, the royalty kind of led in practice of incest. Cousin marriages were like de rigueur. Almost everybody married their cousin. Sibling marriages were pretty rare. I mean, obviously, don't only have any sibling marriages, but cousin marriages were very common. And so in the wider populace, I mean, at least by, I don't know, I read like about 1800s, well, read the German authors like Thomas Mann. I mean, people are always marrying their cousins, and the sort of Herman Hesse, people are always marrying their cousins, like, and Stefan's wife, people are always marrying cousins, like one person marries, one richer cousin marries a poorer cousin, and they kind of take care of each other. And it's kind of a balance of wealth and certain, it's not just about love, it's about wealth as well, maintaining wealth and family. And for the Spanish Habsburgs who really practice incest, uncle, niece, uncle, niece, uncle, niece, which is at a later date, of course, in the rise of the great times of the Catholic Church. I mean, they definitely practice incest. Uncle, niece is very closely incestuous, and by the time they reached poor Charles, I think he was so inbred that he could barely talk. So, I mean, he was definitely a fascinating, funny character, but he was definitely, he was like, and he couldn't breathe, he couldn't do anything really. He was just a comical bastard of God, sort of. So I have a question. So how did the church evolve their talk about incest? I mean, is there a continuity between the popes, or do the popes like continue each other's talk? Or is it one pope's like, well, maybe we can allow for cousin incest? Was there ever a time of that? It seems like cousin incest is so common.
So this is something we're going to get into later. And the reason we're going to get into it later is chapters 5 and 6 are really about the breakaway from the Roman period. And at this period, what characterizes the medieval period in the early stages is that it's obsessed with the old order and overthrowing the old order. And it talks relentlessly about what's wrong with the old order, where, like Augustine writes City of God, and that's his response to Rome as the city of man. And he says, this is why we need God, is because the city of man has proven itself corrupt. And so we need to found our future and our politics on. So everything is being defined in terms of the old order. What you're talking about emerges in the next period, the flourishing period. When Rome is fallen and they can't blame anything on Rome anymore, they start having to focus on, well, what is it we're trying to construct here? It's like, now that we don't have an enemy to fight against, what's our focus? And it's in that you start to get the real tug of war between church and state that defines the medieval period. And that tug of war has there's periods in medieval history that are perfect embodiments of that struggle between church and state. Like, should kings be able to marry their cousins or not? Is there a prohibition against it? Can they get out of it? That's really, there's some great moments that we're going to get to in the history about this. And one of the most famous moments is when Henry VIII decides to kick out the Catholic Church because he wants to get a divorce and marry another woman. And there are previous kings who wanted to do that, but they didn't dare because the church had the upper hand. And the kings were like, well, if I disobey the church is going to remove me as a king. But by the time of Henry VIII, he's gotten to the point where this is late medieval period. He's confident enough that he thinks, you can't remove me. I'm too strong to be removed. So this stuff that you're talking about, incest and the prohibitions, and are they enforced or are they not enforced? This comes in that middle period when people when the tug of war starts to get interesting, when the medieval powers begin to split against each other and fight against each other. That's when we get into that stuff. So we'll deal with that. But right now we're not prepped for it. So I couldn't do justice to your question right now. I can certainly say, for the first.
Thank you for the explanation. It was helpful.
Sure. For the first half of the medieval period, or let's say the first third, it's called the Dark Ages. There's a lot of decentralization. A lot of things stop being empire-wide and start being, just county-wide, or even just, one village-wide. And in those circumstances, incest goes through the roof because people aren't meeting people as much anymore. Their worlds have shrunk down to just the local town. And it doesn't take many generations before you're related to everybody, right? So, who are you supposed to meet? It coming out of the Dark Ages as the trade networks reknit themselves and people start having county fairs and traveling more widely, especially when the pilgrimages begin and people start traveling, long distances to go to a shrine. Then there's more people meeting people they haven't known before. And the possibility for avoiding incest increases, and then the prohibitions start to come down, saying, in fact, let's churn the blood, let's mix people around more, let's put an end to this, this claustral period that we're in. And that's where the tug of war happens, because some people are like, well, it's traditional in my family, we always do it this way.
So I have a question. When Pope Gregory was in power, how important were the injunctions against incest?
Yeah, Gregory, when we get to Gregory, that's going to be a really interesting example.
I don't even know when Gregory was. Was Gregory after this?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we're right now, we're in the 400s and 500s. So Gregory's much
okay.
Yeah. He's a great example, though. He's one of those people we'll come to for sure. So thanks for bringing it up. We'll have to come back to it. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I got a quick question. Is the middle voice, can you equate that with conscience?
Ask that again.
Your middle voice. Can you equate your middle voice with your conscience?
Well, kind of. You kind of can. It's mainly a grammatical voice. It's like, active voice versus passive voice. Sharon administers anesthesia to the patient. There's our active voice. The patient is administered anesthesia by Sharon. That's passive voice, right? Because we're saying that we're focusing on the that it happens, and it's only peripheral that you did it. But middle voice is halfway in between those two. And it's really useful for when things come back upon you as a result of your own action. Hoist on his own petard in ancient Greek can be said in the middle voice very, very beautifully. It's like, it neither happened to you nor did you do it, but sort of both at the same time, if that makes sense. And I won't be good at middle voice for another 3 years. I'm currently doing Latin, but 3 years from now I plan to pick up ancient Greek and start into that. And I know it's going to come up quickly.
Looking at middle voice as an active voice and passive voice, not so much as direct actions, but the interpretation of your actions, what you do. Or should I take that $200? Like I took $200 from this elderly lady, even though I knew she couldn't afford it.
Yes.
And then your conscience kicks in. The middle voice says, you don't really need it. And she needs it a lot more than you. And the passive voice says, I deserve it. Take it. So I don't know. That's the way I looked at it. I looked at the middle voice as character issues. And I'm asking if that's what that is referring to.
No,
and your character issues, your conscience is a big deal. Because that's the one that makes you feel bad. It probably doesn't stop you from doing what you're doing, but it just, gives you that moment of contemplation.
I understand what you're saying now. You're thinking about voice as the voice in your head, the small voice inside. He's not talking about that. He's talking about grammatical voice, and it's just a grammar issue. So here's a link to a Wikipedia article that talks a bit about voice. So um, the big thing is about just how do you structure your sentence. Are you saying Sharon does this, or are you saying this is done by Sharon? If Sharon does this, it's active voice. Sharon's active. She's the protagonist, and it's a heroic story. But if you say this is done by Sharon, you're downplaying the protagonist, and you're focusing on somehow this happened. So when you read press releases from government agencies who are desperately trying not to apologize for having done something wrong, they'll almost always say mistakes were made or there was a policy. Those kinds of wordings are passive voice. And passive voice is a way to try to downplay responsibility and say, I didn't do anything wrong. There was just this policy, and mistakes were made because people followed the policy.
Because I need to understand it. So it's grammatical, not interpretive.
Yes. Yes. And the thing about the grammatical shift is that when you use active voice, now I'm going to use Joe's terms, it's really focusing on agency. Sharon administered the anesthesia.
Yes, yes.
Right? That's full of agency. Sharon has agency. But if we turn it into passive voice and say anesthesia was administered by Sharon, now we're downplaying agency and we're focusing on contingency. This thing just happened. We do know who did it, but that's not the important part, the way we structure the sentence. The sentence is focusing on this thing just occurred. Mistakes were made. I have no regrets.
So you see, I get that, but you see, in the middle voice, a middle voice in that situation doesn't need to be self-reflective, and that's all I'm trying to understand.
Yes. So in the middle voice, you are halfway between agency and contingency, or it's both at the same time. Okay. You're both the actor and acted upon. And so in some ways, it gives you an advantage if you're trying to describe a dialectic of agency and contingency, like the kind that Joe likes to talk about. Middle voice would be perfect for that. And ancient Greek has a middle voice, but we don't in English. So we find ourselves having to either say it's all agency and we use active voice, or we say it's all contingency and then we use passive voice. So that's what Kenneth's talking about here. This is yet another place where English doesn't prepare us to be able to talk about dialectics very easily or clearly. It makes it hard because we want to turn it into one or the other, either agency or contingency. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This is a big question, why the church adopted its policy on relationships and marriage. And there's a lot of debate about it. But certainly for the churchman, when he was coming into that pagan region, that he would have come into a place which had long-term gangland warfare between different families, to the point where families would destroy themselves in the pursuit of their honour. They were coming into a place which was an eternal battle between the Bloods and the Crips or whatever. And some claim that the extended sanguinity was a way of trying to break up these tribal alliances. After all, on certain grounds, tribal alliance would usurp the role of the church. The church is the boss. It's a thing, you know, we've got to remember that the original medieval church was one. It wasn't an Orthodox, it wasn't just a Catholic and a Protestant. All these had been one church at the beginning. And that was their dream of the unity. So maybe part of it was a game to override the old tribal alliances, which tribalism is there today. Mussolini, good Marxist, who believed in the very word of Marx, the true word, the only word. And Marxism's point, when the capitalists start World War I, the workers of the world will arise and overthrow the capitalists. And Mussolini saw the exact opposite happen. The tribal loyalties, after everybody denounced the tribal loyalties and said, we're all going, all the workers will be one, bang, as soon as you push the button, it was back to the tribal loyalty. I was actually going to say with Henry VIII, it wasn't the overthrow of the old system. Yeah, I'm sort of contradicting you, but the old system had been that if a king wanted his way for the right price, he would get it. And certainly the popes realised they couldn't upset the kings too much. What happens with Henry is it would have been slam dunk with the Pope. The trouble was his wife was connected with that large family, I think the Habsburgs, basically, or something like that, this very large family, which had virtually controlled the Pope. And the Habsburg or whatever decided his sister was not going to lose her place in the world. Otherwise, bang, you know, Henry would have gotten his divorce, no worries, normally. But this was the problem. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And that's a perfect illustration of the kind of issues that they were having with popes in the late medieval period. Is they were so entangled with the secular politics, which they were supposed to be separate from, that they couldn't make the decisions that they might have been able to make a few generations before. They were instead they had perverse incentives, and they acted on them, and that really intensified the conflict between church and state and caused the schisms.
It was the French king that dragged the papacy off to Avignon, wasn't it?
Avignon.
When they didn't agree with him.
Yes. Yeah.
It suddenly changed. The prelate had been inviolate almost.
Yes.
Who's going to go up and rough up the Pope?
Right.
My God, how could you do that? Everybody would turn against you. And then suddenly the papacy reached the pinnacle of power around the time of the Crusades, and then suddenly it lost it in a sense and became the tool of politics.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Nothing. I'll talk a little bit about this middle voice. I think you pretty well clarified it, but it's totally grammatical. And the only thing is that when we say it's reflexive, it's not referring to any sort of mental reflection on oneself. In fact, you've posted a few times things, I think, from Heraclitus, maybe from somewhere else, like the thing, I don't know, like when you say from Heraclitus, Phusis loves to hide itself. Well, we always translated it when I took my Heraclitus thing where we looked at the Greek, that hide, that crypto esthai or something, I forget, you know, that esthai ending is the middle voice ending for Greek verbs, which means phusis is hiding itself. There's no other agent that's hiding phusis. And phusis is not hiding something else, it's hiding itself. Yeah, there you see, cryptesthai. That is to hide. And so in English, sometimes people say phusis loves to hide. Other times, maybe it was my Greek professor. What? No, that's hide itself, hide oneself, hide herself, hide his self, whatever, You put in that sort of thing. The only, yeah, that's all that means. It's reflexive in the sense that the actor and the acted upon are the same. It doesn't, and it does clarify things. The other, well, there are some other places I know in Heraclitus where that comes, but the only other thing I read recently was about like Achilles and the becoming, that the Greeks actually had a word for becoming immortal, undying, because they have like thanatos is to die, athanatos is to be undying, and this other process got called athanatosisthai, which meant to make oneself immortal. That is, to be remembered forever by other Greeks.
Yes.
Other than that, I just want Sharon pays such close attention to the text that I thought I'd try and clarify. Although, my Greek is over 50 years old with no practice in the interim. It went away so much faster.
And yet still better than mine.
But you just, you just don't use things, they go away.
Yeah.
And
But can I just say something here? I guess I understand that it's entirely grammatical, but Kenneth goes on to say it is the circular or self-reflection, reflexive action upon oneself, which is at one and at the same time active as passive, active as well as passive. I can see where that is grammatical. But then the next couple of sentences that led me to think about conscience says, in moral matters, humans are self-victimized by their own vices. Is that self-victimization also self-reflective?
Yes.
well,
Yes.
it's reflective in terms of the action. It's not mental reflection on oneself. I don't think Kenneth is saying that.
Right.
He's saying that when we act morally, when we act, the moral consequences of that come back on ourselves.
Yes.
For good or evil. In one case, they reveal a vice, in the other case, they may reveal a virtue. But it's the action that does that, not self-consciousness or mental reflection.
Yes.
Maybe I think that's consistent.
I'm getting it, but then, further down they talked about how the Christian regime impacted the self-reflective process. A couple of sentences down.
Yes.
So, I am trying
Christian psychology is not Greek psychology.
Okay, good point.
But
it's not. I don't. It's just yes, things change, and I think you have to read the first part about sort of the ancient way in which they would have looked at this, and then the Greek way, and then you see the change.
Okay, very good. Got it.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, Sharon, because I hadn't thought about this, and you're absolutely right. It's the word self-reflection can be read two completely different ways. And this is a case where Kenneth doesn't actually mean it both ways, although he might be making a bitter joke about it would be better if it were both ways. But he's saying non-self-reflective people nevertheless find the moral consequences of their actions reflecting back upon themselves. And so it's self-reflective in the sense that the enemy in the world that we think we're fighting is often ourselves and the consequences of our own actions. But if we were self-reflective enough, we would realize that but we're fighting a self-reflection. But instead, we're not self-reflective, and so we blunder out into the world trying to scapegoat things that are really our own fault. Yeah. That's part of what's here, and part of what he's trying to emphasize with this, and this is what we're going to spend our time. I'm glad you brought it up. This is what we're going to spend our time on today, is this idea that there was a lot in the Greek world that was forgiven. A lot of bad behavior could be forgiven. It's natural during war to do these things. It's just human nature. What can you do? You can't fight against your own nature. There's a sense in which the grown-up version of the ancient view of free will and determinism would have it that you have a duty to cultivate yourself. But as people found themselves trapped within the empire with limited scope for change in their lives, they descended into this fatality, this fatalism, where they would focus on the fact my nature made me do it. And then they would leave out the part that it made me do it because I neglected my responsibility to cultivate myself into having a better nature. They'd leave that part out, and then they'd be focused on feeling infantilized and pacified and feeling like victims of circumstances. And this is when the craze for astrology takes off, right? Do you have a good character or a bad character? The original intent was, regardless of which one you're born with, you're supposed to cultivate it so it becomes better than it was when you were born. But what it devolves into is people saying, oh, there's nothing I can do with my life because I was born with a bad character. That's just how it is. Oh, well, I give up, right? And likewise, people born with a good character would then excuse every bad thing they later did by saying, well, I'm of a noble character, so it's all right when I do it, even though their character, by not cultivating it, it may have gotten much worse than it was when they were born. That is, they've devolved. Their vices have reflected back upon themselves, if you know what I mean.
This self-reflection, excuse me, part of know thyself?
Yes, it should be. That's the sense of self-reflection that Kenneth's being ironic about, and saying if these people would know themselves, they would recognize how much of their own troubles are being generated by themselves. But they're not self-reflective. They don't know themselves. And so the self-reflection that comes back at them, they think it's the world being mean to them. And they don't get that. I mean, this is one of the things. I was in therapy for 24 years in another life, and because I had a crazy upbringing, and one of the things that my counselor worked with me a lot on is getting to understand the way that I would litter the path ahead of me with landmines. I would neglect things, and then they would blow up at some random point weeks or months from now and cause a problem. And when they caused the problem, I'd be like, oh my God, why is this happening? She said, don't you remember we talked about this 6 months ago and you were going to do something to keep this from happening, and then you didn't? The reason it blew up is because you left a landmine in your path. You were generating some percentage of your problems in life, not all of them, right? Like Joe says, it's agency and contingency, but some percentage of my problems in life are being generated by myself through my actions or my neglect. And this is Kenneth's focus here, self-reflection, right? The things I'm contending with in the world, a certain percentage of them are just the consequences of my own actions. And then the question that he's ironically posing here is, can someone self-reflect enough to realize the extent to which they're fighting a self-reflection in the world, or at least partially? So go ahead.
I think this is a lot subtler than I originally thought. There is this play on the middle voice.
Yes.
Its grammatical meaning. Normally it's like, I hit myself in the head.
Yes.
but also, and the middle voice doesn't refer to the self-reflection of know thyself.
Right.
You know, that quote doesn't even use the middle voice. That's
Ironically.
Genothi Seaton. You know, that's not the middle voice there. But it is a subtle, a kind of a play on how you read self-reflection.
Yes.
But that's also becomes a critical thing in how we move from the ancient view to the more modern view, where
Yes.
you know where and how sometimes the modern view lacks, yeah, the way I like this paragraph. I didn't discuss any of this when I was talking with Kenneth. Uh, Maybe I should have. I should take a list of questions
You
or
could just
something.
call him.
Well, it seems to me, to my uneducated mind, it seems to have current, meaning Greek, and future, meaning Christian, implications.
It does.
Interpretation of that middle voice and that self-reflection,
Yes.
clarification seems necessary to me, so ordinary citizens like me don't get confused.
Yes. Yes. There's some very subtle humor involved in this paragraph. He didn't quite spell out as clearly as he normally does. But the transition that he's trying to make here, which I want to note before I start calling on the hands, is that by the corrupt late period of the ancient regime, people got very passive about their own character. Oh, well, it just is what it is. That's just how things are. And it led to a certain fatalism. And one of the breaths of fresh air that the new medieval movement brought to the world is this idea that no, you can't settle for whatever daimon possesses you. Jesus is here to free you from the daimons, and you have then freedom to act in the world and to make yourself somebody better. It How bad you've been in the past, I mean, that's only part of your story. The question is who you're going to be today and tomorrow. Do you want to reinvent yourself? And so there's this breath of spirit that's being blown into this tired old regime to say, you can and should self-reflect, and you should see whether you can cultivate your character into a better direction. Now, it is warped because it's not focused on character. It's focused on, can you find salvation in Jesus? Can you lift yourself up enough to mend your ways and want to be a better person? But it's like kissing cousins. Sorry, that just came out from the earlier thing. It's like kissing cousins to the idea of cultivating your own character. It's a less pacified, less fatalistic approach to your own identity. And the motivation is, God, heaven and hell. There's big stakes at play. It's getting people off their butt to think about, maybe I should make some changes in my life. So you can.
I might just butt in at this moment. Yeah, this was a point of Pelagius
Yeah.
at the time of Augustine, when he was a British monk that comes to Rome and is shocked by the laxness of the Christians. And so he's emphasizing, control over your own character. But he becomes classed as a heretic, as though he's saying man can
Yes,
save himself.
he gets into trouble that way. But I mean, your point, Stephen, is it shows the spirit of the times. There is one of the things about the early medieval movement is even when things start to get lax, there's always springing up new people going, I just read Jesus in Mark, and I'm pretty sure he wants us to get off our butts and make some change. There is this kind of, this is where Kenneth's going with this idea of soul in motion is spirit, and this early medieval Christianity is really trying to get the soul in motion again. The belief is that under the late corrupt Roman Empire, it's really stagnant, and the waters are not moving, and they're trying to get it moving again. They're saying things don't have to be this way, but you're going to have to get off your butt and do something. So yeah, Sharon, thank you for emphasizing us to explore this question of self-reflection and spirit. This is what this paragraph is all about, for sure. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I think Sharon brought up a very, very important issue about self-reflection in this middle voice. I always wonder, like the Greeks, there was always the players, and then there was always the chorus. The chorus seems to be something that's external, uh, but it sort of lays the groundwork for the mistakes that's made, I guess, by the main protagonist. And so the, the tragedy, the heroic tragedy. So in some sense, but the Greeks, they actually believe in fate. In other words, fate was just some destiny that happens to you. It wasn't fully under your control. I mean, think of Oedipus. It took a lot for him to pop out of himself and pull his eyes out because he finally realized that he offended things. But all along, he just think, well, probably it's just fate. That's my destiny, it has nothing to do with me as such. So I wonder to what degree, I kept thinking to myself, like, to what degree did the chorus slowly disappear? I wonder whether Euripides was already beginning to remove the chorus from the plays. I don't know. So I'm just asking a question. But in the Middle Ages, it seems to me that the chorus, from what little I remember from the Second Shepherd play, was the voice of the church, the external church in some sense. Then I wonder, like, to what degree was that internalized in Shakespeare? I'm thinking particularly of Hamlet, you know, when he began, somewhere along the line, he says the line in soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is a question. Talk about somebody who's confused whether to exist or not exist. It doesn't make any difference. Then later on, he says, you know who's guilty? It's the king. The play is the thing to catch the conscience of the king. But in acting the play, he also netted himself psychologically in the process, right? In other words, it was in some sense to be or not to be. It doesn't matter. So did Shakespeare, particularly through Hamlet, turn this external voice, whether that's the Greek chorus or the church, uh, conscious of the church, of the divine voice, into a complete psychological battle? That's in a sense a psychology of the individual. So was he, in that sense, already extremely modern in the sense that, we are in control of a destiny, but on the other hand, we also trapped by our own behavior. So, I mean, Shakespeare was a pretty powerful writer. I'm wondering whether that was not the modern turn, that we are responsible for what we do, even though we didn't want it, nonetheless,
Mhm.
because we are thrown into the world where it doesn't matter to be or not to be. Doesn't make any difference. Okay, so I wonder, Shakespeare did, I mean, he was probably as powerful as any of the Greek writers. And in some sense, he's already turned, kind of in some sense, eliminated the Greek chorus and eliminated the divine law overseeing things. And it's only a struggle within ourselves. And that seems like self-reflection, uh, and in some sense, a kind of middle way in the
Yeah.
third voice,
Yeah.
and in terms of consciousness of individuals. although I'm not sure if his Hamlet felt guilty for what he did, although he might have felt very guilty for what he did to Ophelia. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
Rick, can I just add one sentence that I think is pretty powerful because he brought up
Please.
theology and Shakespeare. And Kenneth Smith, in almost completing this paragraph, he says, theology as complex as particle physics was germinated out of Christian morality, out of the psychology of radical self-accountability. That, I think, sums it all up. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I mean, those are these are the final sentences of this paragraph and of this chapter where he brings it to a crux. And what Phil's talking about with Shakespeare, my favorite book on Shakespeare is Harold Bloom's book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. And it's my favorite because it's the boldest book about Shakespeare I've ever read, where he basically claims that Shakespeare invented the modern personality. And you at first think, okay, that's just a crazy idea. But then he makes his argument, and it's actually a pretty good argument. And one of his arguments is that there have been many different ways that people have tried to depict self-reflection on the stage throughout history. And he argues that Shakespeare is the very first time that the way that self-reflection is done is by somebody having a soliloquy and overhearing themselves and going, oh my God, is that what I think? That's a terrible idea. I'm going to do something different. I don't want to be like that. He says previously people would overhear other characters, either other characters or the chorus or somebody else, would be the source of reaction. But in Shakespeare, the soliloquy is the source of reaction, and the soliloquy is the internal dialogue, which is somebody being self-reflective and overhearing their own thoughts and then thinking, oh, that doesn't sound good, does it? I don't like the kind of person I would be if I acted on that thought. I think I should change my direction. And Hamlet is one of the key examples he gives. That very speech you're citing.
I love that, Rick. Thank you for that. I've never heard that.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's quite an entertaining book.
Yeah, because in Greek tragedies, it was a chorus who
Yes.
reacts to what happens on stage with the main character, like Oedipus,
Exactly.
But you're right. In Shakespeare's plays, you have those soliloquies. That's one fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's his idea. It's pretty clever. And he argues that Chaucer almost got there. The Wife of Bath is almost self-reflective in Canterbury Tales, but not quite. And Falstaff is like an in-between step. He gets closer. But you start to get these characters like Hamlet, these tragic characters who can hear themselves and self-reflect and change direction. So, and it's funny because English has no middle voice, and yet here Shakespeare has found a way to depict it clearly on stage to be so when someone realizes this is the double self-reflection Sharon was talking about, where not only are the consequences of their actions rebounding upon them, as Phil points out, but they are noticing. They're self-reflective enough to discover that that's happening and then change their fate as a result.
If I might jump in here, I noticed the date of this book, but I can recall in the 70s, somebody in a bookshop pointing it out to a book about Shakespeare, claiming the same general principle that the modern mind you see rooted in Shakespeare.
Yeah. He'd made this point in earlier books, but this is the book where he finally said, I need to stop mentioning this theory casually on the side while writing other books. I need to write a book just about this theory. So you'll see references to it in the Western canon, and you'll see references to it in his book on Freud, which is where he argues that psychotherapy was the result of Freud reading Shakespeare and thinking, wow, that's clever, I'm going to do that. Which again sounds like a crazy theory out of left field, except then he cites Freud saying that's what happened. Freud himself actually says, if it weren't for Shakespeare, I never would have invented psychohistory. That's where it came from. Which I don't know why they don't teach that in school, because that is a crazy, wild idea. It's this kind of thing that would stick, right? Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, there's so much on my mind going. This would be such a rich discussion. First, I want to discuss the again, I'm amazed by um, similarities between Hebrew and ancient Greece. It can't be so coincidental how these languages are so similar in their metastructure. Specifically, so there's a verb form called hitpael, it means the construction of the reflexive form. And it's this middle voice. And so there's two classic examples of this when there's a language called Malbish Arumim, for when a human dresses him or herself. He's acting upon himself, but the language of it is very odd, this verb form, and there in Hebrew they often have a very hard time teaching this as like, because there's no English equivalent, because it's the actor is acting upon himself and thus is also being acted upon by himself. So are you the passive subject or the active subject in this verb tense? You're both. You're being acted upon. And then the classic one in the Bible of this, which actually sounds very similar, but I think is a different set of words. It's letters. It's almost like wood and wood. Is the verb for palel, which is to pray, and the origin of this is that it's self-examination is what you're doing in the original form of the Hebrew. You're essentially doing what you realize is you're essentially creating a soliloquy, like you're saying with Shakespeare, or you're supposed to be, and then you're supposed to be doing a meta-analysis on the soliloquy. And this reminds me actually of, if we're really going to say something here, it's like that soliloquy thing that Harold Bloom is saying is actually really reminds me of what cognitive behavioral therapy is all about. You're supposed to be reframing the narratives of the self, and this goes into then a larger sense of how brain scientists, you know me, in neuroscience, there's a good argument that there's between left and right hemispheric dynamics, there's a primacy involved, a structural invariance where you have the narrative self, which is why the left hemisphere has access to language, but then you have an experiential self, which the right hemisphere can listen to language but can't speak it, right? It understands language, it can hear language, but it can't speak it. And so then you create this actor acting upon relationship, but then it's a causer, which is like, let's say, the narrative, wherever you want to start the circle of paradox, is the causer is causing the nervous system to experience something, but then the nervous system changes based on the experience it has, right? So the caused becomes the causer, which then becomes the caused. And so you get this loop. And so in cognitive behavioral therapy, what you do is you're trying to identify the narratives in play, which are kind of like those landmines that you might be talking about 6 months out the road, what are called, in a lot of ways, at least for other people, but for the self as well, they're called projective identification. This is Jungian, but it's based on Freud. All this stuff is very similar. These projective identifications are essentially our defense mechanisms, where it's like, you're in a bad relationship and someone's, I don't know, abusing you, rather than be like, oh, I'm just going to walk away, or you're abusing them. You'll create this whole elaborate narrative of a projection of why this is happening, and then you eliminate your own agency within that narrative, right? You say, oh, this is happening to me. In the political sense, I look at this as what's now called um, competitive victimhood, which is essentially removing responsibility from the equation, which is essentially removing the agency. You have no agentic voice, right? These are just happening to me, and therefore I just need my rights, my entitlements, so then things will stop happening to me. As we're like, okay, this is my story. Well, how can I rewrite the story so that I can have a different role in it, right? So there's this very much palentropy between the agentic self, the agency self, and the contingency self, and you get a third perspective, which is like you're looking at a mirror, and then you can move in the mirror, and then the mirror shows you how you've moved, and then you can readjust. And so you get this dialogue with yourself, but then the mirror actually changes its curvature based on how you move with it. This is the strange thing in neuroscience. It's really exciting, of neuroplasticity, is that you can actually rewrite the underlying mechanisms or predispositions, the ethos, for your narrative, right? And so you get this very beautiful, reflexive self-examination. You get this. I don't know if the middle voice is which works well in English. It seems to me nothing in English, because it's not really the self, the agency self, or the contingency self, some sort of Sofer Sunni word. We need that in English, where you're both the agent and the contingent. We need a word that just screams dialectic, but for this specific. And it's just as beautiful to me to go back to the beginning of, like, it's not very common, but there's this form in Hebrew that is a very well-known form of it's called the reflexive, or reciprocal type thing. And I actually wanted to last say, and the way my brain works, I like to link this to other meta narratives or language structures, which essentially is math. Typically in math, when you're doing calculus, like the Newtonian type of calculus, even the Einstein types of tensor, super fancy calculus, you're taking a really complex multidimensional object, and when you can break it down into a simplified way, it can look like a straight line. That looks like an agent or a contingent. It's a one-way thing, things are happening to it, or it's doing things. But there's another type of mathematical language that is self-reflexive, or has the word called isomorphism, which is a fancy way of saying self-similar, or you can get to a transformation where you get back to the original, really. That is what we call a fractal structure, a recurrence. And to me, this is where we have the middle voice, and this heat pa'el form of verb really reminds me of a fractal structure, that every time you go deeper and deeper, you actually have a smaller version of the original. You don't have a linearized, simple version of it where it's just, oh no, that was just an actor and that was just doing things to me, or I was just doing things. But as you go deeper and deeper, it still retains this reciprocal structure, this self-similar, essentially like a flow with a beginning and an end that are the same place. And this is why in math they call it a non-linear structure, as opposed to a linear. We just think of line. Anything that's not a line would be non-linear. But this type of language, non-linear means that the end point and the beginning point can be the same point, like a clock, right? And that's what you get. What you get, a line that becomes in 2 dimensions becomes a circle and it goes back on itself. So it's really cool to me when you really delve into this, how the math of this fractal or self-similar types of recurrence also really reflects the same thing that's going on in the philosophical language, or the language of words, with this actor and acted upon, and they're happening at the same time. I was thinking, like, we don't have it in English, but it's like a soccer team playing with themselves. Like, it's like they're doing it with each other. Each one is both an actor and an acted upon in this sort of team where they're practicing amongst themselves. But it's not a with. They're not playing with each other. They're more playing to each other. But neither of those words work in English. We don't have this. But I'm just really interested in this whole. I think this is what Kenneth is ending on here, is really deep and powerful, especially when he involves, probably subconsciously. I don't think he really studied physics and math the same way, but I don't know anything about him, so I'm just projecting that he didn't realize when he's saying like particle physics, which there's a waveform that collapses when it's observed, but it also does things. This is very much in this paradox of who's the causer, where's the cause? There's a mutual causality going on here, and it's very, again, non-linear. It's very fractal. It's very heat pa'el. It's very middle path, very middle voice, where there's the actors and the acting. Who's doing the acting and who's being acted upon is not just a gray area of taking turns and you can never see. They're both happening all the time.
Yes.
Right? The simultaneity of, that's a good word for it. It's a simultaneity of process. All right, I'll pull a Phil. That's it, me. That's Ari.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. Kenneth's not a physicist, but he's read enough about quantum physics to encounter that issue of the paradox of observation changing the thing that you're looking at, the velocity versus position. And he's written about that in particular as an example. It tickles him. He loves to find things like that because it runs right into these topics that we're talking about at the end of this chapter. He has a parable in one of his books where he talks about a photographer friend telling him to dip his fingers in the developing solution. And when he rubs his fingers together in the developing solution, it suddenly feels smooth and slick. And his friend tells him, but it's not smooth and slick. That's the developing solution dissolving the outer part of your skin and making it, feel smooth. And what you're feeling is your own dissolving skin, but it feels like that's not what you're feeling. And again, he's tickled by these sort of cognitive illusions and perceptual illusions and how they play into things. So just, you know, I've done a lot more physics study than he has, but he immediately knew what it meant when he ran into this issue of velocity and position, and you can't get both at the same time. You know, he finds those things and he works them right into the philosophy. So that idea of the mind and how it functions and the mirror that changes its shape in reaction to your self-reflection, I think he would love that. That's his kind of jam. I haven't heard him talk about that particular issue in neuropsychology yet, but I think he would just love that. Because effectively that's what he's trying to describe in this ancient Greek perspective on the mind when he says, you know, that the the unconscious part of the mind does most of the work. It looks out into a field that has essentially an infinite number of interesting details in it and collapses it down to the few that your conscious mind notices. And it's like it's framing the possibilities for what your conscious mind is even capable of thinking long before you think a single conscious thought. It's like that issue of, you know, if you can cultivate your character, then you can develop your unconscious and change its priorities. Then it starts showing you things you couldn't see before, which means you can start thinking thoughts you could never think before because the subject matter of the thought was previously invisible. Your unconscious just erased it from the picture to draw forward the 7 plus or minus 2 things you could think about. So I love this stuff. It's really interesting. And it really gets into that sweet spot between agency and contingency that seems to be where we live. I remember a book on cat psychology talking about that we shouldn't be surprised that cats always want to be in doorways. They want the doorway open. It's like we always want to say, are you coming in or are you going out? And the cat looks at you like, what are you, crazy? This is the best place. Leave the door open. I'll sit right here in the doorway. I think of Phil every time, right? I want to equivocate on the boundary between the city and the wilderness. This is the spot. Why would I choose one or the other when I can be on the boundary and work between them? And Christopher Alexander says the same thing in his works on architecture. He says people love to be in window seats. People love window seats. They love outdoor rooms where it's partially enclosed and partially not. They like open doors with screen doors where the wind blows through. They like to be right on the edges and the transitions between things. It's really appealing to be in those zones where we can shift fluidly from one side of the equation to the other and not be stuck in one of them. All of this stuff is really interesting. So anyway, thank you, Ari. I really appreciate that. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think what Ari just shared was actually very, very interesting. I mean, so far as I've been thinking about it in a lot of different ways, and this idea of even truth itself being, as he was saying, you know, it's like a tensor, it's nonlinear, versus it being like a scalar, where it's, you know, there's a single value. And if you look at it, if you start to look at the middle way or the middle voice, I'm sorry, as a scalar, it's like, well, life is happening to me, and that's it. Or I am happening to life, and that's it. And it's either or, versus it actually being something in this middle voice, which is actually kind of it's much more nuanced, whereas, you know, it's not necessarily binary. So you know, from looking at it from that perspective, it's, you know, it starts to get pretty interesting as far as then what is the right way to view reality. And this is where I think that it's pretty interesting so far as when we talk about things like ethics, and, you know, managing your character. And that's what essentially kind of has been highlighting throughout this entire, you know, all his works really. So it's this, what do we manage? You manage your character. That is something that you are trying to understand. And if you're managing your character, I mean, you're understanding yourself in order to manage your character. And if you're managing your character, you're not necessarily saying either one of those, life happens to you or it's happening to me. You're just basically doing the best that you possibly can in order to make the decisions that are aligned with you know, with your values. But I was wondering, in a sense, that if there is an element of, and I will say, I'll just, you know, I was going to talk a little bit about the idea of CBT or even REBT or any of these languages. Yes, the way we use our words will actually shape our reality. And so then that's a really important point when actually when you're talking about, evaluating a situation. That if you start to go with either one of those, then that your perception is that either you've overcome a situation or the situation has overcome you, and neither is necessarily true. So this is like the idea of Epictetus. That's not the thing that upsets us, but rather our opinion about them. So that's really that. It's so that's where it's our opinion, not necessarily evaluating the situation for what it is. But one of the questions that I also have is there like, is this somehow like almost an Aristotelian way of looking at things, like a golden mean almost, so that, it's not where you have an element of humility on one end, which is actually is, kind of defined by Aristotle is more is that it's looking at the world that I'm lesser than, and you may not be lesser than based on the circumstances. You have this work perception of reality that you're not lesser than because of any particular circumstance that you're in. But the other end of this is arrogance, where you feel like you're, that you've basically overcome a situation and that the situation you're in control, and that this is the idea of agency, that it's all about agency, or the other one's all about contingency. So it's almost like there's this middle way of looking at it, this golden mean, and that's so how you would actually kind of have an accurate depiction of like what is wise, what is wisdom within a particular circumstance. So I kind of feel like that's where there is some interesting overlap there, because neither one is true per se. So the language that we use will actually allow us to represent reality. It will also allow us to kind of not either think that not value contingency too much, nor value agency too much.
Yeah, it makes a big difference how things are expressed, doesn't it? I mean, it's like if you enter a restaurant and someone hands you a menu, it's logical to assume that these are the choices. How often do we say, "What else do you offer?" that isn't on the menu? And that's our relationship to language, is we're handed this collection of words to try to understand ourselves in reality, and we just assume that's it. I mean, why would there be other choices that aren't on the menu? That must somehow we've got to try to hammer the world into either agency or contingency, and the idea that they could both be there and both be necessary, and you don't pick between them. Well, that only occurs to us if our language has those kinds of modes of speech and makes it part of the menu that we could choose that. Otherwise, it's not that it's impossible, but my God, it can take a lifetime to even discover the possibility. It's you're fighting the language every step of the way. Every word you say is not quite right, and you're having to explain, I'm sorry, I'm not saying this well. That's just what happens when we're stuck in these modes. So yeah, it's these are great points you're making, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, and really quickly, just this idea of man's will as a principle over the moral order, but then man is morally a principle, a center unto himself, only because he is marked by his spirit. And I feel like it's kind of from there. He's kind of really talking about essentially how do we maintain our character.
Yes. Yes. I mean, effectively, what he's doing is what he's asserting in chapter 6 is that these various spiritualist movements that grew up on the periphery of the Orthodox center of medieval Christianity, they were getting back to this Hellenist spirit that's all throughout the New Testament, but not obviously so. You have to think about it. You have to take the time to chew over the text and figure out what it's saying. But if you do, you can sort of get back to this earlier ancient conception in which, as he said, I think it was in paragraph 4, both both Aristotle and Jesus say you have the ability and the duty to cultivate your character. It's not optional. You're not allowed to just live your life each day as though it's your last. You have to get in there and deal with the bullshit you carry around. You have to, because who else's responsibility is that? They've got their own bullshit they have to deal with. That's in their character. So it's got to be our responsibility to deal with that stuff. But if we start to do that, if we start to cultivate our character, then we change our fate. On the one hand, we're still fated. It's that character is
Right.
fate. But on the other hand, we're altering the fate, which is a fascinating idea. I mean, it is a hugely empowering conception of what it means to be human. And it was part of the ancient world until it got lost during the corruption of the Roman Empire. And so what's weird is that this medieval Christian movement is arising to overthrow the ancient world. And the heart, the most revolutionary part of it, is just recapturing this old ancient idea that got lost along the way. This is that idea of spirit. It's not enough to have a character. You also have to be cultivating your character and transforming your future. And that's the breath of spirit that can move through a human being in a way that it can't move through a cheetah. The cheetah has huge advantages over us because it's got Soprasune. And, no bets. We surrender. We grant that it wins that game. And it's the most important game. But the second most important game we're really good at, which is whatever we've been up until now, if we can take responsibility for our character, we can begin to change who we are. And medieval Christianity leaned hard on that. Which
Yeah,
is,
no, I appreciate that, and I've talked long enough, but I do want to come back to this idea of how language can be used as a tensor versus a scalar.
Yes.
Because there are ways, actually, because this is one of the major problems that we have in society today, is that people are triggered by a word, because it's this or that. It's in conflict with what it is, what we believe is absolute.
Yes.
And so this idea of how do you then, the question then becomes, and I think that there are ways, how do you capture tensor, with this idea, with language, with words,
Yeah.
or is it with words? And are there other means of communication where the way you can kind of capture that? And there are.
Yeah. It's very interesting stuff. Thanks for bringing it up, Joe. For those who don't have the math or physics background, I put a link to Wikipedia articles on tensors and scalars. The Wikipedia articles on these subjects aren't the best in the world. They're expert friendly, I think is the way it's often said. They lack the introductory part. What the hell are we talking about? And like to dive right into the math. But tensors versus scalars are a really fundamental issue in both math and physics. So it's probably something we'll explore some more going ahead.
I want to jump in real fast and just say next time I speak, I'm gonna do a like I'm five version of these two things.
Nice. That'll be great. All right, well then let's go to Michelle. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so going back to your talk about Harold Bloom. I mean, I thought maybe we put in mind self-consciousness. I think self-consciousness arises before Shakespearean characters, and people already have some self-consciousness. I remember, I mean, I think most people have very strong self-consciousness these days. I mean, I remember like pre-self-consciousness. I also remember, but I've always had like a hang up over like I don't look right or whatever, I'm fat or stuff like that, and I just remember like when I was younger, I wasn't like absolutely devastating and beautiful. I never thought, oh, I'm ugly in the mirror, or how do I look in the mirror? And that just never came into mind. I never thought, how do I sound? How do I sound when I talk? This is extreme, and there's this book called Age of Anxiety, and anxiety kind of comes from the self-consciousness. And Lady Macbeth, for example, in Shakespeare, and I don't read a lot of Shakespeare, but I do remember Lady Macbeth, and she had a lot of anxiety. I mean, out of all Shakespearean characters, I think she probably has the most prominent anxiety. She has PSTD, she has OCD, she has anxiety. She has these psychological symptoms, and I think that's really extraordinary. She's a really extraordinary character. I mean, I haven't actually read Macbeth. I do know about the character, and I have seen some depictions of her on video and stuff and plays. But yeah, I feel like with the age of anxiety, we have this extraordinary self-consciousness where you're picking yourself apart. You feel like, and that creates distortion. It might create some clarity, but its own way it creates distortion. And psychology, in its own way, creates clarity and distortion. I mean, you have the whole, during the 70s, you have the whole like, oh, I was, molested by all my parents, my whole family. I was drugged up by Satanists at a youth club. You have all these like memories spouting up. You don't know, and people are like, I don't believe that happened, but you're like, oh, I have memories, or I don't have memories, and I have symptoms, or I have images. You don't know what's what.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, Lady Macbeth is a very interesting character for the reasons you cite. She on the one hand eggs on her husband to commit the regicide, but then afterwards, despite her confidence, she's the one where her unconscious keeps welling up the PTSD trauma memory of the death. The out damn spot. Can't get her hands clean, always wanting to wash. Is the struggle that she's going on between her conscious mind, which thought this was going to be easy and she was going to feel great about it, and her unconscious mind, which is saying, no, we don't feel great about this. Yes, we did it, and it was easy to do, but it's not so easy to live with the consequences, and we don't know why. We don't understand what's happening. It's fascinating, that whole partially reflective, but she doesn't entirely understand that what the trauma she's suffering is entirely of her own making. And so that's where it gets really interesting with this stuff. I mean, it's one of the things, I think it was in either Western canon or Shakespeare, by Bloom, that I first ran across the idea. It was probably in Shakespeare that I ran across the idea that listening to the voice in your head and realizing that that's you, and realizing that you don't have to do what it says, and that you could do something different, was didn't which we take for granted, right? As people are always, sitcoms even will have a little voiceover, and people go, no, I don't think so. But he points out that people really didn't do that in plays. He says the Greeks, for example, didn't believe that the still small voice in your head was your voice. They thought that was the God speaking to you. There's places in various Greek plays and in some of the epics where, for example, Odysseus has an aha, what we would call an aha experience. Oh, I should build a hollow horse. We should put soldiers in. They'll just take us right into the gate. This is going to be great. Only Odysseus doesn't say, I just had a great idea. Odysseus says, Athena just gave me a great idea. Athena spoke to me. They're constant. They thought the gods are with you at all times, and that they're frequently whispering in your ear, and that's the voice in your head that you're hearing. So that idea that that's not somebody else, that's you, and that's your own mind generating it, and you're starting to be aware of yourself, was evidently not only not something the Greeks thought, but it was incompatible with their religion. Their religion caused them to, we would say, misinterpret the voice in their head as being the voice of somebody else. Now, that might be us misreading the Greeks, but that's what it looks like to us when we read that text, and the aha experience gets chalked up to Athena instead of, haha, I just had a clever idea. And it's interesting. It's interesting stuff, because we take the modern perspective so much for granted. It's hard to there's all kinds of questions that never occurs to us to ask. Before I read that in Harold Bloom's book, it never would have occurred to me to ask the question, what if people didn't used to know that the voice in their head was theirs? I just wouldn't. That's not a question I would have asked, But once he raises it, now I can't get it out of my head. That's interesting. What else? I start to wonder: am I taking for granted that I just assume everybody always did things the way that they do it now? We talked last week about, and it's not a subtle manner by any means, but we talked about archaeologists are raising the question whether war is a recent invention, which to us is a crazy idea. We know that people are warlike and have always fought wars. We just know it. It's part of the modern ideology. But we actually can't find any archaeological evidence of battlefields before a certain date, even though there were people. And even though we know people were violent. We've got murder victims. We've got, injuries. We know people hurt each other. But there's just no battlefields before a certain date, even though there's still lots of people. And we don't know why that is. Now, it might be that we were fighting wars before that. Sure, that's a possibility. But just even as a possibility, what I find intriguing is the possibility that before that date, there weren't wars being fought, and that we can't recognize the evidence because it's so unthinkable to us, because we're so buried in our ideologies that we assume people in the past must have always done things the same way that we do them, just in an inferior version. So I'm not committed to any of the answers. I'm really intrigued by asking questions that never occurred to me to ask before, regardless of what the answer turns out to be. It's really exciting stuff when you get into these things. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I might, at a later period, address what Michelle said, the conflict between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. But right now, I want to address the issue of the cats sitting at the door. When you said that, one of the things that occurs to me is that cats are very, very independent. They're not herd animals like cattle or dogs even. Dogs are followers. And so in some sense, it's hard to herd cats together to do their thing. They're independent. And that comment reminded me that cats are, in a sense, very self-independent in their own way. And it reminded me of Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp did this piece about the doors. The door is either closed or it's open. Those are the choices you have. And he built this room. It's 3 rooms with one door. And the door could be closed and open at the same time. There's some there's some middle ground, which is the middle voice, like, no, it's not closed, no, it's not open. It could be closed and open at the same time, or open and open at the same time. It can't be closed and closed at the same time. So it's important for the human mind to be able to spread out that not only everything is a dialectic, there's a third possibility in the middle that we all forgotten because we got trapped in the thing that something is either this way or that way. and and there's always some middle ground. I mean, even when you're cooking, you could add some other spice other than what the cookbook says, and that changes things. So it was a very, very clever piece, that actually showed that don't just stop with either that, this or that. The human mind is always creative enough to find some middle ground in which you can explore new possibilities. That's creativity. It's very, very important because the human mind does have creativity on its side rather than just this or that. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. Marcel Duchamp is a real big hero of mine.
Yeah.
By showing that creativity is a very, very important part of being human. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's a Heraclitus quote that used to make me scratch my head. There are ways to interpret it, and I wasn't clear which way he meant it. Where he says the way up and the way down are the same way, and it can partly be talking about, he talks about, Earth turning to liquid, liquid evaporating to gas, gas catching fire, and they used to believe that the direction of fire was the more rarefied, and that was the way up. Leads towards the stars and the celestial heavens, or the way down towards Earth would be, the other direction. So it could be that he could be talking about early physics and state transitions, but he could also be talking about cultivation of character because he talks about that a great deal, and so this sentence from Kenneth Smith from this paragraph where he says, in moral matters, humans are self-victimized by their own vices and self-elevated by their virtues. Part of the implication from the sentences around it, what Kenneth is saying is, and it's the same process in both cases. It's the self-reflection, right? The consequences of our actions rebound upon us. And so if our actions are vicious, then we suffer those consequences. But if our actions, have virtue, by the definition of virtue that the Greeks mean, it means that it's moving in the direction of health and vitality for ourselves and also for the people around us and the environment. And that means that what rebounds upon us is something that we enjoy and are delighted by. And we're happier, we're living in a better world. And it's the same world in both cases, and it's the same fundamental action, the self-reflection, the unintended consequences of our actions, as Ari said, the shape that comes back around to itself, the circle or the helix, when looked at from the right angle. And so he could easily have meant it this way. This could be what Heraclitus had in mind, is what Kenneth has written here, that the what is specific to it, because it goes with ethos anthropoi daimon. It goes very strongly with that notion of cultivating your character. And why do you cultivate your character? Because you don't want to be throwing landmines at the road ahead of you, because then you're going to step on them and they're going to blow you up. You want to be planting fruit trees on the road ahead of you so that when you're hungry, you can pick the fruits of your actions and enjoy them. And all of this is bound up in that concept. So this could easily be part of his human ethics, set of discussions rather than his physics set of discussions.
Well, let me add something to what you just said. It has something to do with when I was in high school physics. My teacher said, glass is not a solid, it's a frozen liquid, right? And that surprised me. But okay. But now, do you know that in quantum physics, they have been able to freeze light, frozen light? In other words, light itself could be turned into a solid. I mean, I think, could you imagine in quantum computing how frozen light could be a property that we invented and create to, in a sense, transform things, not in terms of, let's say, electro waves through copper wires, but frozen light is much, much faster in computing and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, that didn't come all by itself, or maybe it would have, it exists in quantum physics, but no other animals have discovered quantum, light, frozen light.
Yeah.
And could you imagine how inventive that is? So that's kind of interesting, quantum physics in relationship to quantum technology.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just leave it at that right now.
Crazy inventive. As an update, when I was in school, I was also told that glass is a liquid, but that's since been disproven. We used to think that glass was a liquid. It turns out it's an amorphous solid, a non-crystalline solid. And the reason we used to think it was a liquid was partly because of the ripples in panes of glass and how it would be thicker at the bottom than it was at the top, and there was rippling. And we used to say that's a very slow, viscous flow. That was what I was told in school. When I took physics classes, that was what I was told. But they've since discovered, no, the way where those ripples and unevenness come from is that it's very, very hard to make glass that's perfect. It's just really tough. And the methods that were being used, in the early 20th century left us with glass with ripples in it. It didn't flow. That's just how it came off the construction. And it turns out, they did experiments where they watched glass for a century, and it didn't change. The ripples stayed right where they were the whole time. So they now know it's basically a non-crystalline transparent solid, which is its own weird. It's become its own weird area of material science, is studying things that are in the category of glass, because it's pretty strange. But it was a beautiful idea, and I believed it for 30 years. And I really thought it was this really cool. This really cool viscous, highly viscous liquid. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was told the glass one when I was in school as a kid as well, and believed it for years too. So I was also misled. I was just going to do something a little bit separate and give a plug for Spengler, since Michelle is here. As I said, about 20 years ago, when I came across the idea that the Republicans and Democrats in America were going for people who just simply politically bickered into enemy camps, and I thought, oh, well, of course, I was a child of the 1960s or 1970s, and the idea that the two halves of Anglo-Saxon politics would go to war against each other was thinking, what drugs are you on? What have you been smoking? How can you believe such a thing? But then I was looking at this 20 years ago and I still had that feeling like, how could this be possible? But then I looked at history, and history is full of examples. And the classic would be a decline of the Roman Republic, where the two sides of politics grew and warred against each other. And as far as the law went, well, the law is just another weapon to be used against the other guy. And now, and I realise now, of course, it was only in recent days that somebody showed Spengler to me, and Spengler was basically saying this 100 years ago. And he published his book at the end of World War One about the decline of the West. And it was immediate, it was a huge hit in Germany because what went wrong? How could we have lost? But he comes up with the Goetherian idea that civilizations follow the path where they start as a bud and then they flower and then they wilt. Or if you like, he said that the modern West had its, Western Rome fell and it was replaced eventually by a modern West, which grew up in its wake. In the Dark Ages, this new West was in its infancy, and nobody would have noticed it. If you were, taken by an angel and were floating above the English Channel and the angel said, you live about 1000 AD. Look at all these people, they're living in mud, the Frisians, the Dutch, the Germans, whatever, Scandinavians, the British, the Spanish and all that. Well, Spanish didn't look too bad, but the rest of these guys, the angel said, do you know in about 8 centuries' time, these guys will be dominating the world? You would have flipped. But as he pointed out, you're looking at this culture in its infancy and you think, well, this is the ugly duckling. Well, it's never going to get anywhere. And he said it reaches the stage of youth. You've gone beyond infancy in the high Middle Ages. You're starting to see something. You're seeing the Gothic cathedrals. You're starting to see, well, they're still a bit behind the rest of the world, but they're looking good. They're sort of coming up in the world. And then the maturity, the phase of maturity, when the culture fruits, was when the new West exploded on the world. The Chinese suddenly find themselves finding sea battles with a pack of barbarians called the Dutch. The emperor would ask, where did these guys come from? Oh, the other side of the world. How is that possible? It's inconceivable. And of course, the modern West, it was obvious. The modern West had exploded, but Spengler warns, well, eventually you reach a phase of old age. And this culture has now reached its old age phase. And he warns that about a century after his time, the West would become the playground of the Caesars. Now, we've taught from the word go, democracy, democracy, liberty, liberty. These are the gods. Who could speak against them? You must be insane. They're running around the streets going, no kings, which has been done before, and they got a king anyway. But Spengler made this outstanding prediction, and they just don't understand the world's turned. We went from, I remember when I was a kid, they'd go, the politicians would stand up and said, well, now it's time to go home for Christmas, greet your family and friends, and think of more spiritual things. And a few decades later, we have Gordon Gekko saying greed is good. And it's like the highest order on the political agenda is the consumption of the people. every little silly thing that they want. It's not just what the necessities of life are. It's a tragedy that I won't be able to get some fripperies. Absolute tragedy. How dare you threaten my fripperies? This is where we're living. This is why we are getting the tyrant. It's not the tyrant's fault he's been a tyrant. It's our fault for creating the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It puts us in mind of one of the most famous speeches about the U.S. Constitution, which came from Benjamin Franklin right after the new Constitution was there, and he voted for it. And what he had to say about it, well, I'll link to the whole speech, but this is the critical part of his quote. That's people like to quote the first part of this quote and not the second part of the quote, which is a pity because it's the second part that's the most telling. You know, what may be a blessing to the people if well administered, and believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years, but then that's where people stop. But then he goes on, and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. That was Benjamin Franklin on the U.S. Constitution when he voted for it. He said, "It'll do for now, but watch out for the corruption of the people when they will eventually
He'd
require
been reading the Greeks, had he?
I know, right? I mean, definitely. You can smell the Aristotle all over this.
The Greeks had said democracy is a bad system of government because it entertains one thing, the appetite.
They said, well, if it's a good system or a bad system depends on the people. Do they have sophrosyne or do they not have sophrosyne? If they do not have sophrosyne, you're going to be in hell. You'll be sorry, because it'll just be a bunch of appetites voting for who to eat for lunch. So yeah, it's interesting times we're living in. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. If you're still there, but you got to unmute. Okay, we'll have to come back to Ari. I think he stepped away. So Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, when I saw this thing that started a lot of this conversation, theology as complex as particle physics was germinated out of Christian morality. I didn't think of, Heisenberg's principle of, or, the standard model of particle physics with its, 21 fermions or muons or whatever. I thought of the Summa Theologica. That would be as complex as particle physics. And if you needed it dumbed down, you could read the Summa Contra Gentiles. Where he explains it to heathens, stuff. So I kind of think, yeah, if you look at the kind of all the teachings from all the theologians, I'm sure they equally outweigh things written by particle physicists. They've only been at it about 100 years, the particle physicist, and the Christian theologians have easily been at it 1,000 years. So I don't know, and I was thinking too when you talked about Pol Pot. Obviously, I want to say literal minded, but I don't know. There was a French intellectual, somewhat public philosopher, Bernard-Henri Lévy, wrote some essays. And I read some of them. I think they were in the Atlantic. He had some published in the Wall Street Journal on Pol Pot. Where did Pol Pot learn this stuff? Well, he learned it in Paris when he went to school. And he learned it from good French Marxists who were smart enough not to actually believe any of it and to go home and have a fine dinner and a glass of wine instead of actually killing the bourgeois, the bourgeois. So I think in some ways, I was thinking about that in terms of our current problem, is that modern Christianity largely continues to succeed because it's not so foolish as to believe all of this stuff. It can have the form, but not the content. And there's been quite a bit of disruption in the modern church with the introduction of Christianity to Africa, because there's a lot of talk about African bishops and cardinals who say, haven't y'all read this stuff? Don't y'all take it seriously? Your policies include actually promoting sinfulness, but they will learn that it's all about fancy dress and funny hats and don't take any of it too literally, because that's what lets us live together in a sense. Is that everybody knows it's not something worth dying for. So anyway, that's enough. And you've got Ari back on here.
Yay. Thank you, Donald. So since Ari was ahead of you in the line, I'm going to call on Ari before I call on you, Phil. So go ahead, Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, first, Donald was saying is now on my mind. I had this whole thing, which I still do a little bit about tensors and scalars and essentially vector fields versus scalar fields. But man, what Donald was saying was really good. It reminded me of when I said that the Jewish parable of God was making the world and angels are like, dude, you're going to see that all the people are going to behave badly, paid falsely, and then God throws truth to the ground so that peace can arise. And it's just like, yeah, these are things to live by, but you can't take them too seriously. But if you don't take them seriously enough, then so it's right. So wow. But no. So anyway, so I was thinking about scalars and vectors. Essentially, so scalar field, like I don't know if Joe's still here. Yeah, he is. Okay, hopefully he's listening. So the way I understand this again for like I'm 5, because part of my mind is like I'm 5, and the other part is really quite advanced. It's interesting. I got the child self and the adult self. The child self is like, this is all nonsense. What the heck's going on? The adult self is like, I got this crazy scheme to explain it to you. I'll sell it to you. It's right. Used car salesman self of the tensors versus scalars. So anyway, so scalars are apparently simple. It's like money. You either have it or you don't, and it's highly abstract, and it doesn't actually have a real physical nature. It's something that's purely in the almost the spiritual imaginary world. It has to be like again, temperature is just an amount of it, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any action in the world. It's purely I think it's called an ordinal system of pure hierarchy. There's just 3 is bigger than 2. All right, so you got more of it, and you got exactly a specific amount of 50% more of it, this kind of thing. But what it is or what it's doing is completely eliminated from the math. And so we would almost say, we'd like to say this is a one-dimensional approach, but it's really not. It's in technicality, it's like a zero-dimensional approach, because a dimension represents a degree of freedom, meaning that I can move along a line forward or backwards. And in this case, it would seem like time is a dimension, right? Because you can move forward in time. But really, because you can't move backwards in time, and it's more like time is moving through us rather than we're moving through time, time is actually a scalar. It's like, how many years do I have left? Oh, I got 10 years left. How many days before the weekend's coming? I got 3 days left, right? You don't think, oh, because this large gravitational field is showing up, my 3 days are going to really be like 2 seconds. Like, nobody thinks like this, right? Time is a purely abstract feature that has, strangely, no physicality, but grounds all other physicality. And so I look at it as time as like the ultimate scalar, even though mathematically it is treated as a vector. But really, I think from a conceptual point of view, time is a pure scalar. I got 3 days, I got 4 days. It's just an amount of it. And it's not actually doing anything, but then all the things are happening within it or because of it. And so this is where I think of space. This is backing up a little bit the idea of the original paradigm of the universe is just time and space. So with energy involved, is time is always moving forward, exactly the same. And so there is no directionality to it, so to speak, because directionality requires being relative to something else. Right? It can only go some direction if I'm also, it's the perfect Palentropolis, right? I can only go forward unless I'm going backwards. Otherwise, no, we're just staying right here and time is moving through us. We're not moving at all. But then space is a real classic vector field. I've got amounts of things. I've got locations that have like height versus depth, but they're also in relation to other things. Am I moving forward or moving back? And so the simplest idea to understand a scalar versus a vector field or a tensor field is really like Phil's classic Heraclitus. A vector field is always changing. It's always moving. And so this is why energy for the longest time in Newtonian physics was thought of as a scalar. I just got X units of energy. I got joules, right? I got a certain amount of it. And this is often like in video games and other things, energy is looked at this way. It's just an object. But really, energy is a subject. It's always, and this is what Einstein did very differently with his density of energy, but density in terms of like where it's going, what it's doing, right? Imagine a bulge, like a giant, I don't know, ice melts and it creates this large wave, and then the ice goes with the wave, right? Well, it's where the ice is, the density of that whole thing is different. And then it causes everything else around it to have a bit of a different density. And you have this dialectic of densities between each other, how the densities are moving. So I really like the idea to marry these two things. I've actually never talked about this like this before. I've never had a group that can understand both the beginnings of tensors, but also things like Sophrosyne and dialectics and Heraclitus. The Heraclitus was a tensor man. He was always seeing things in motion, right? You can't step in the same river twice because its density has changed. It's always moving. It's always doing things. It's got degrees of freedom, right? So this is what a tensor field is all about, and this is what modern physics changed. Was everything's always changing, always moving. But in terms of this causality, you can start to figure out if there's if there's a big wave on the horizon, like a tsunami coming, we'll know we can precisely figure out how far into the village it's going to tear up, right? And how many people it's going to take with it, kind of thing, right? We can see it coming, so we can use tensor fields to make excellent predictive models. We can do a lot more prediction with it, and then intelligence gets involved, and intelligence is all about prediction, right? So we love these tensor fields. But then the scalar fields are really interesting because they give us a way to get back from this simultaneity and have like an anchor position in terms of an object, like the amount of energy, the amount of heat, the amount of entropy. These don't have relationships to other things when they're being measured, which when we are actually talking about the paradox of like, position and momentum, that's all about observation and the measurement problem, right? The observer doing the observation is then changed through his observation, right? So this is not an observer, this is an actor, right? You're actually poking the bear, you're not just looking at the bear. And every time you poke the bear's different. So scalar fields are really interesting, especially the Higgs field, which is called a field, is actually it's not a tensor, it's supposed to be a scalar, right? It's supposed to be this pure object, you just have some of it. So physics is locked in this really strange paradoxical dialectic that it hasn't answered or figured out. It needs to get it, so to speak, pardon my language, it needs to get its shit together, because this it doesn't understand the relationship between scalars and tensors, and which one's the causer, and which one's the caused, and it's really both in this weird relationship. But to get back to the Lycom 5 for the simple, rather than my digressions that are really interesting towards like Sophrosyne, is a tensor is the river that's always moving and how it's doing and relating with itself, up and down or both the same direction in two different forms. But then you have the scalar that the river just right now, how full is it? How much river? Maybe it's a dry bed. That's a zero river, right? That's a scalar, right? So we also look at things and how much is there of the river right now? Can I draw some water from the river, kind of thing? So the scalar is just a thing in itself and has no relationships and is very useful in this sense as an object within an intersubjective. And then the tensor is more like the verbs, and the scalar is more like the nouns, I think. but in general, the tensor is all about relationships and things moving with each other and having this amount of stuff, just like a scalar, but also its direction, basically a vector. You have magnitude and you have direction. But in a real a complicated tensor, you actually have lots of directions all at once that can be summed in one way. But really, that's a reduced version of lots of different causes all causing each other at the same time. All right, that's it. That's Ari. That's good.
That's great, Ari. Thank you. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I said I was going to say something about the relationship between the conscious and the subconscious in the battlefield, or what controls that relationship. And I will say something very personal uh, after I give this introduction. You know, when I was studying, I was giving a lecture about reflection, and I'm talking about specifically referring to Narcissus. And Narcissus, the reflection was, it was so immediate and beautiful, he couldn't look beyond the present. He fell in love with himself because, well, he was just incredibly beautiful. And so reflection have this meaning of immediacy. And I suppose you could generalize it into like the immediacy is so immediate that it's eternal in some sense. But in some sense, uh, there's another term for reflection, which is deep thinking, which is philosophy, actually, in a way, reflecting in thought the possibility, which is essentially philosophy. So that, in a sense, is a kind of an important process because that kind of reflection, of course, it reminds me of Heidegger's being and time. In other words, it's not only an eternal thing, but it is dynamic in this process and unfolds. And that unfolding means that there is a horizon in which the horizon transforms it in relation, not only in terms of human relationships, but being unfolds itself through time. So that's important. Now I'll say something about what I did. Back about 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I used to spend a lot of time at the beaches collecting beautiful rocks. I had quite a collection of it. And they're very beautiful. They're not like minerals. I mean, they're based on my aesthetic understanding. And so at one point, I had some pretty good rocks, but it was just too much for my collection. So I took a bunch and a bag full back into the beach, not put it in the water, but sort of maybe 50 feet away from the beach itself, in hopes that somebody would find it. So I put it that, and next day I come along and it still was there. And so I went to look for some more rocks. And on the way back, the father and the son was there, and the father was just very enthusiastically collecting the rocks. Of course, the son was sucking on a rock, and the father was like rather rude, I thought. He said, I told you to stop sucking on the rock. That was it. I thought, wow, what a way to treat your son. So nonetheless, I didn't want to bother the relationship between the father and the son. So I was a little bit grossed out. What happened was the kid actually took the rock that he was sucking and offered it to me. And I said, God, like I was a little grossed out, like got all his slime, all over it. So I walked about 30 feet. Then I suddenly stopped and I realized I had made a big mistake and I totally regretted that forever. And this is where otherness comes in. Because if I had reacted in the right time, I was just reacting to what the kid gave me, the most precious thing he owned in the world at that moment. And I should have said, oh, thank you so much for doing this. But when I walked 30 feet away and had double back, that would not have been the right time. That means I would be contradicting what the father said. So I walked away, but regretted that because what happened was the relationship of otherness. I've always been sort of somewhat sensitive to otherness. I didn't include him in my relationship with others at that moment. And I regretted that because if I had said something positive, thank you, that would have meant that it reinforced his generosity. And I didn't do that. And I regretted that ever since because I didn't help him to come into himself, to the future of what he could be. In fact, he was left by the father saying, I told you not to do that, right? Which is a different destiny. And I regretted that, even though on a personal level, well, it didn't literally hurt me, but it hurt me psychologically. That in some sense, I didn't fulfill my promise to him to come into himself in the future because he does not live in the moment itself, but he crosses the horizon and live in the future. And I did not do that. And I regretted that ever since. And, like, but that was a big mistake. I don't know what else I could have done after I was untimely in my understanding of not reinforcing that at the same time, because that would have been a direct response to the kid, not something that would, you know, uh, the divisive of the father, because I was just responding to the instant. So that was my psychological battle because I was untimely in my response. And I always thought that I was sensitive to others, but obviously in that situation I failed. So that's a very personal relationship that psychologically, in some sense, that was a battle I lost to my unconscious. I
Yes.
should have realized, no, 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 respond right now. But I was grossed out. Plus, those were my rocks to begin with. And I made a big mistake. So that's the personal battle, psychological battle between my consciousness and subconscious.
The little
So
voice.
that's it.
Thank you, Phil. It's actually quite a good illustration of that issue of reflectiveness, self-reflection. And the timing doesn't always work out the way we want it to, but you had the ability to take that experience and reprocess it and think about in the future, how do you want to act? What do you want to do differently? Um,
I think I learned that lesson. I think I learned that lesson.
exactly.
Like, I mean, you make mistakes in life, but you learn the lesson and you try not to do that again.
Yeah. Well, you do if you have the character that tells you that it's valuable and good to critique yourself and question yourself. Lots of people don't, and it creates a problem for them in their lives because they can't learn from experiences like that. They just push it behind them. This is the othering that you were talking about. It always makes me think of Murphy's Law. A big part of what Kenneth's talking about in paragraph 6 here is this issue of, even though he's not saying it explicitly, I like to reword it as the law of unintended consequences. That the things we do, when we intend to do things, we're not just responsible for the good results that we thought were going to come out. We're also responsible for the bad results. Because, I mean, who else is supposed to be responsible if not us? We're the ones that did the action. But people would rather not be responsible for the bad consequences of their actions. They want to make that somebody else's problem, and just take the good part and say, well, I'm a good person, so all the good consequences are to my credit. But the bad consequence, because I'm a good person, the bad consequences are not my fault. I must find some bad person somewhere in the world, and we can blame blame them on that person. So it's part of why I like Murphy's Law. And when I was a kid, I hated Murphy's Law. I thought it was just negativity. I was that kind of person who didn't want to own the negative unintended consequences of my actions because I was young. I was immature and defensive, nervous. But I gradually, as the decades of being a medical software developer, I came to understand Murphy's Law is brilliant. Yeah, people think it's sarcastic, and it really isn't. I mean, there's humor in it, for no doubt, but it's literally the way things work. That everything we do has unintended consequences, and those too are our responsibility. And a properly structured software development organization will ensure that the unintended negative consequences of our programming won't go to some field support department. They'll come back to us because that's how we close the loop and can learn from our mistakes and do better tomorrow than we did yesterday. But this issue of taking responsibility for our character as part of taking responsibility for the consequences of our actions and creating a feedback loop that allows our character to change so that we do something different in the future than we did in the past. This reminds me of the issue in software of recursion. Recursion is an incredibly powerful tool, and it's where rather than writing a program that does what you tell it per se, you write a program that, sure, it does what you tell it, but then part of what you tell it is take this same pattern and apply it at another level. So like you can use it to walk through trees and say, say you want to print out all the nodes in a tree. You could write it the hard way, in which you manually go through you write a huge program that manually goes through all the nodes. Or you can write it recursively and say, whatever node I'm on, print that out. And then loop through my children and call myself for each of my children. And so, when it calls itself, it'll then, again, print out its node and then look and see if it has children. And so the thing, what happens is what would have been pages and pages and pages of text of programming might only be 2 or 3 lines of code. It's just the code is dead simple because it's self-reflective. It's leveraging itself, but it also is very hard to get right because everything that you do is going to echo on every single node that it applies to. And you always have to ask yourself, have I covered all the cases correctly? Is this thing just going to degenerate and crash all over the place? Or have I just written a brilliant 3-line program? And so it's the thing about evolution when it changed us from creatures that were largely framed in by instincts to ensure that we had sophrosyne. And it said, okay, well, we're going to ditch the sophrosyne because it's the only way to get the frame off of you. And then we're going to compensate by giving you this recursive self-reflective capacity. Now that you have it, you can do all kinds of incredible, powerful things for good and for ill. And let's just see what happens, says evolution. Off we go. Shoo, shoo. Well, let's see if it's productive or not productive. And here we are in the middle, just trying to carry out the experiment and hoping that it doesn't bite us in the ass. Stephen, tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, yes. The curious idea that war is a recent invention. I was wondering if you could give me a link for that one. Anyway, I just put up the Royal Standard of Verse, so that's a phrase from the 26th century BC, which clearly shows an organised army, since the Sumerian city-states were having perpetual turf wars. And eventually, of course, it culminated in Sargon, who conquered and the whole region and created the Akkadian Empire.
Yes.
But something similar that happened in ancient Egypt, which is much more obscure, when the Scorpion King conquered all of Egypt. But
yes,
This idea, for example, people have this idea that, you know, the indigenous tribes of the various places the Europeans colonized were somehow saintly nature creatures.
Oh no, there's no reason to think that.
Yeah. Well, what they don't realize is that the biggest killers of the indigenous when the white men came were other indigenous. So the thing is, the white men had the guns.
Yeah,
Do you want to fight the guy with the guns?
right.
If I'm going to expand, I'm in trouble. This white man's taking my land. Well, I can't fight him. Who am I going to go and hit?
Yes.
Other indigenous.
Yes.
And it's recorded, you know, you have the case of indigenous tribes totally wiping out other indigenous tribes. The enormous tribalism too. If you were a member of the enemy tribe, you were perhaps an enemy forever. There's one sly tribe that got slaughtered in the own region where I lived as a kid. And the last two remaining full-blooded survivors had to join the white men for survival. That's where they lived the rest of their lives because the other tribe decided all must die.
Yes.
So you have this extreme
Oh yes.
undeterrent sort of tribal warfare. And there's this constant thing, they're sort of treating these supposedly primitive peoples like they're dumb, that they
Right.
don't have any ideas, that they don't have any drives. They're just innocent flower children to be manipulated
Right.
any way we want. They don't have a mind of their own.
Then we discover
They
they
don't
do.
have agency. You know, this is purely the product of the modern evil, modern culture. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was just wondering this whole idea of
Yes.
flower power in ancient times and war was a
Yes.
recent invention. I know about the Tolents, but if there's a link for that.
That's the example. And
Oh,
it's not that it's the oldest battlefield. I've been misspeaking for a while. It's that it's the oldest battlefield in Europe. They haven't found any older ones in Europe.
that can be picked up, yeah.
Yeah, they've been dating them, and this is the oldest one we found. And the thing that shocked me is I assumed it would be 10,000, 15,000 years old, but it's not. It's just shockingly recent. It dates to the Indo-European invasion of Europe, and we haven't found any yet before that. They could be there. They might be waiting to be found. But backing up what you said, the classic example is the Maori, right? Because in documented historical times, the Maori completely defeated another tribe and killed and ate them all. It's well tested that they were just, it was shocking. And even Maori historians say, oh yeah, we did that. That's part of our history.
Why waste good meat?
I mean, it raises questions.
You've got Captain Cook on your menu today. That'll be the feast of the all time, wouldn't it?
Yes. So the point isn't to say that it's true that this is how it was. The point is it's just to notice how shocking the idea is. It's clearly, immediately we rush in to fill the breach and prove that it can't be true. And I'm always interested in ideas like that we have this strong reflex against. For me, the jury's out. We've got the Tolensi Valley battlefield, and I follow archaeology closely. It's one of my favorite fields. And if they find an older one, yay. But if they don't,
I think there is older evidence. I think there is evidence of mass slaughters, but it's disputable.
From Europe. Yeah, if you find them, point me at them. I'd like to read about them. It's a favorite topic of mine.
I'll keep that in mind. Okay, thank you.
I suppose it's a little creepy that it's a favorite topic of mine, but it is. I'm very interested in it. So thank you, Stephen. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. I think you get the final say for today.
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, I was just really going to make a quick comment about the idea of responsibility and kind of owning the outcome. Because there is one important aspect of this is obviously the first one is your intention, right? So what do you intend? Because obviously you don't control the outcome, whatever it is. So the responsibility is more about having your intention pure than anything else. That's really taking it kind of where you're taking the responsibility. But there's this other aspect of it that's a little bit more in the execution phase, the idea of changing what you were doing versus maybe staying the course. And that's where like there's a lot of wisdom in that. Because sometimes, the circumstances actually may have dictated where you did the right things, but the outcome just didn't come out the way you anticipated or had desired. So you have to be able to separate the circumstances and the process that you used in order to make your decision, and whether or not it's sound or not, and differentiate that from whether or not you need to evaluate your process. And that's it's a very difficult thing to do many times, because when you're sometimes you could be just doing all the right things, but things are just not working out. And but we're very rarely honest with ourselves. But again, but this is also this element of well, this is judgment ultimately more than anything, but I think more importantly that it's really understanding the environment that we're in. The contingency aspect of things is critical. Maintaining your intention, though, your character, is something that you can always do.
Yes, that's right. We can't control the outcome, but we can lean on the outcome if we focus on the thing that's within our control, which is working on our own choices and trying to do better. It's a great point, Joe. With that, we wrap up for this week. Thank you, everybody. I had a lovely time. I hope you had a lovely time. And we'll see you next week. We'll start into chapter 7.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice weekend. Get better, Phil.
Yeah, bye-bye. Feel better. It's good to see everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.